Good morning. Just a message to members of council online. If you can turn your cameras on, that would be helpful. We're just trying to get quorum established. Good morning, everyone. We are ready to begin. Good morning. My name is Councillor Stephen Holliday. I'm the chair of the Audit Committee. We have quorum. I'm now calling meeting 2 to order. Welcome, everyone. Today's meeting is being held by video conference and in person at City Hall in Committee Room 1. This meeting is also being live streamed online at youtube.com/Toronto City Council Live. Although we may be meeting in different locations today, the Audit Committee would like to acknowledge that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. If you are registered to speak at today's meeting, please listen for me to call your name. I will call speakers in the order that they appear in the list. The list of speakers can be viewed online by visiting the Audit Committee link at toronto.ca/council and clicking the speakers box for today's meeting. And at present, we do not have any speakers registered, however that may change. Members, the City Clerk has provided all agenda materials on toronto.ca/council and on the CMP, the Clerk's Meeting Portal. Clerk's IT staff are available to members if you need help with your devices. I also want to remind you to please submit and approve your motions by email. Staff are available at Audit Committee at toronto.ca to help with motions. Are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? If you do have an interest, please raise your hand or unmute your mic and indicate the item number and the nature of the interest. Seeing none, may I have a motion to confirm the minutes from our meeting on February 13, 2023? Councillor Nunziata moves. All those in favor? Any opposed? And that item carries. Members, we have 14 items on our agenda and an item of new business. Excuse me. We have 14 items on our agenda, and we'll review the agenda now. Starting with item 2.1. So AU 2.1 is the 2022 audited financial statements, consolidated city sinking funds, and consolidated trust funds. There's a staff presentation on this item, so I'll hold it. AU 2.2 is the City of Toronto Audit Findings Report for the year ended December 31st, 2022. And there is a presentation from KPMG. So I'll hold that. AU 2.3, financial statements for the year ended December 31st, 2022, the agencies. Anyone with questions on that item? Anyone wishing to speak? May I have a member move that particular item? Councillor Nunziata moves AU 2.3. All those in favor? Any opposed? That item carries. AU 2.4, status of the financial statement audits of the city's agencies and corporations for the year ended December 31st, 2022. Are there any questions on that item? Anyone wishing to speak? May I have a member of the committee move that item? Councillor Malik moves that item. All those in favor? Any opposed? That item carries. AU 2.5 is a review of the procurement and award of winter maintenance performance-based contracts. And there is some intro remarks from the Auditor General, so I'll hold that item. AU 2.6 is winter maintenance program follow-up status of previous Auditor General's recommendations and processes to hold contractors accountable to new contract terms. There's a presentation on this matter, so I'll hold that item. AU 2.7, City of Toronto's Modular Housing Initiative, the need to balance fast delivery with stronger management of contracts and costs. There is a presentation available from the Housing Secretariat on this item. Perhaps I'll just check with members. Are there questions on that item? There are questions, so Councillor Malik, it's okay, I'll let you hold that item. Thank you. The presentation is optional, I think. Or Madam Moderator, I'll just get some clarity here, lots of notes.
Yeah, either the video or presentation.
The video, thank you. Okay, so we're working on a video for that. Great. AU 2.8, Auditor General's June 2023 status report on outstanding recommendations. Are there any members wishing to question this item? Seeing none. Any members wishing to speak on the item? May I have a member move the item? Councillor Myers moves that item. All those in favor? Any opposed? That item carries. AU 2.9, investigation into allegations of wrongdoing regarding building inspections of 2 houses. There is some introduction remarks on that item, so I'll hold it in my name. AU 2.10, Auditor General's Office report on the results of applying specified auditing procedures to financial information other than financial statements for the years ended December 31st, 2022 and 2021. Are there any questions on this item? Any members wishing to speak on the item? May I have a member move the item, please? Anyone? Councillor Nunziata moves the item. All those in favor? Any opposed? That item carries. AU 2.11, award of request for proposal, document 3872, 102334 to Grant Thornton LLP for external audit services for city arenas, community centers, and other entities. Any members with questions on this item? Any members wishing to speak? May I have a member move the item, please? Councillor Nunziata moves the item. All those in favor? Any opposed? And that carries. AU 2.12, Community Centers 2022 and 2021 audited financial statements and status of outstanding 2022 audited financial statements. Are there any members with questions on this item? Anyone wishing to speak on the item? May I have a member move the item? Councillor Nunziata moves AU 2.12. All those in favor? Any opposed? And that is carried. AU 2.13, Arenas 2019 audited financial statements of Leaside Memorial Community Gardens Arena and status of outstanding 2022 and prior audited financial statements. Are there any questions on this item? Are there any members wishing to speak on this item? May I have a member move the item? Councillor Myers moves the item. Just before we vote, I will just say thank you for bringing forward the 2019 financial statement. I know that's been a long journey. I look forward to the subsequent years. All those in favor? Any opposed? And that item carries. AU 2.12, Business Improvement Areas, update on the 2020 to 2022 audited financial statements. Are there any members with questions on this item? Are there any members wishing to speak on this item? May I have a member move the item? Councillor Nunziata moves the item. All those in favor? Any opposed? And that item carries. Mr. Clerk, I think that was the last on the list. Yes. Great. Okay, so we will go back up to the top of the list. AU 2.1, 2022 audited financial statements, consolidated city sinking funds, and consolidated trust funds. We do have a presentation on this, and I will welcome city staff to the podium and ask you to begin when you're ready. Thank you.
Good morning. We'll just give it a minute to get the presentation up and then we'll begin. Okay. All right, good morning, Chair Holliday and members of Audit Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. My name is Sandra Calaferetti and I'm the Director of Accounting Services. Joining me are Dury Lee, Project Director, and Thaksha Suthakavalan, Manager from the Corporate Financial Reporting Team within Accounting Services. Our presentation is focused on the city's 2022 audited consolidated financial statements, which incorporate the city's sinking fund balances. The statements include entities such as the TTC and Toronto Atmospheric Fund that are controlled by council and material to the city's financial position and performance. The 2022 statements will receive an unqualified audit opinion from KPMG. The city's financial transactions are executed and statements prepared in accordance with Public Sector Accounting Standards, or PSAS, used by all public sector organizations in Canada. PSAS require that expenses be recognized when incurred and revenues when earned, as opposed to when cash is paid out or received. PSAS also requires that the city recognize assets when future benefits are expected and liabilities when obligations must be settled in the future. Financial statements play a crucial role in the city's accountability cycle. While we start the year with a budget that sets out our priorities, we end the year with audited consolidated statements that tell City Council, residents and businesses, and all other readers what we actually accomplished. Over to you, Thaksha.
Thank you, Sandra. I will start off today's presentation by providing you with a brief overview of the City of Toronto's 2022 financial position, which is reflected in our balance sheet. As can be seen by the bar graph on the left, there has been a steady increase in the city's total financial assets, non-financial assets, liabilities, and accumulated surplus over the last several years. The growth seen in these balances in 2022 were fairly consistent with the growth seen in these balances in prior years. When looking at the composition of the city's asset and liability balances, there are several things to note. On the asset side, we can see that 70%, or the vast majority of the city's assets, are made up of tangible capital assets, or TCA. Tangible capital assets are non-financial assets that have a useful life that extend beyond 1 year. The city maintains a large variety of TCA, assets such as roads, buildings, water and wastewater pipes, construction equipment, and playgrounds. Over the last several years, the city has prioritized its investments in TCA in order to better serve its residents. In terms of the city's liabilities, roughly 60% of the total liability amount is comprised of long-term debt and deferred revenue. In order to assess the financial health of the city, there are a number of financial ratios that can be monitored. Today, we would like to highlight 2 ratios for your consideration. The first ratio is the liquidity ratio. This ratio assesses the liquidity of our assets and, in particular, whether we have sufficient resources on hand to settle our existing obligations to others. In 2022, our liquidity ratio was 66%, indicating that we had a favorable mix of liquid assets. Our liquidity has steadily increased over the last several years. This is deliberate. We have been protecting our liquid assets because of the increasing demands on our infrastructure and the uncertainty related to the pandemic. We have been exercising more prudent financial management strategies at a time when support from other levels of government is uncertain. The second ratio we would like to highlight is the accounts receivable turnover ratio. The AR turnover ratio is a measure of how quickly a municipality is able to collect accounts receivable from external organizations. The higher the ratio, the better it is. Over the last several years, our AR turnover ratio has slowed down. This is an area we will continue to monitor for improvement in 2023. As mentioned earlier, TCAs represent a significant portion of our assets. We monitor ratios related to the average age of our TCAs. One such ratio is the net book value of TCA as a percentage of the historical cost of TCA. A higher ratio indicates that the city owns and uses newer assets to deliver services. This ratio has been fairly consistent for the last several years at 64% and is consistent with other Canadian municipalities at 67%. In 2022, we issued $1.279 billion of long-term debt for TCAs. To support future repayment of our long-term debt, we hold a separate set of investments, which are known as sinking funds. We time the maturity of these sinking fund investments with our repayment schedules so that we have sufficient cash on hand to settle our existing obligations. We monitor our debt capacity by considering the proportion of the city's revenues that are used to pay for our ongoing financing charges. In 2022, we used 5.3% of our consolidated revenues towards financing charges. Our robust debt policies have allowed us to maintain strong credit ratings during the year. In conclusion, we only obtain debt to make ongoing investments in TCAs for service delivery. Over to you, Dury.
Thank you, Thaksha, and good morning. The city's income statement provides an overview of how the city performed with respect to revenues earned and expenses incurred. Similar to what was presented on earlier slides, the city's finances are continuing to show impacts resulting from the pandemic. In the current year, the city's revenues increased largely due to 1, improvements in the TTC's ridership numbers. Specifically, TTC's ridership improved by 61% in comparison to prior years as commuters started to return to the office. Number 2, increase in water consumption. Toronto's relatively dry summer season and reopening of businesses increased the demand for water and wastewater services and thereby increased the amount of user fees collected. And number 3, proceeds received from various land sales. Increases in revenues were then largely offset by increases in our expenses. Factors such as the inflationary environment, high housing costs, and greater number of asylum seekers due to the reopening of Canadian borders led to increased demand for various services, such as childcare services, Ontario Works programs, respite centers, and refugee claimant serving programs. Next slide, please. This slide shows that the majority of the city's revenues are generated from taxation-related revenues, user fees, and government grants. Taxation-related revenues have remained largely the same. However, user fees and government grants were affected during the pandemic. As residents and businesses resumed regular operations, the city observed a favorable impact on user fees this year. Government grants have also started to return to pre-pandemic levels and therefore decreased, which may be challenging if services resulting from the pandemic need to be sustained. Next slide, please. Earlier, we observed that government grants are starting to return to pre-pandemic levels. This trend is most noticeable when we take a look at the pandemic-specific financial support that we have been receiving from both the federal and provincial levels of government. In comparison to the earlier pandemic years, government grants decreased for the first time in 2022. The city expects to see further decreases in 2023. Government grants represent an essential source of revenue for the city. In fact, grants supported approximately 32% of total expenses in the current year. As a result, the city will need to closely monitor changes to this balance, as further decreases may affect decisions regarding service offerings and levels, as well as revenue-related strategies and models. Thank you, and over to you, Sandra.
Thanks, Jerry. KPMG performs a number of procedures in order to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence before issuing an opinion on the city's statements. In doing so, it is not unusual for KPMG or the auditors to identify findings in the recognition of financial transactions, particularly in large organizations with decentralized accounting functions. During the city's 2022 audit, KPMG identified various findings associated with the recognition of the city's tangible capital assets, both recognition and disclosure. Although these capital transactions were recognized properly for budget purposes, PSAS requires asset recognition based on certain criteria. The specific findings are not reflected in the city's statements. However, they will inform our ongoing improvements to the TCA reporting process. KPMG's recent management letter observations and recommendations, including their 2022 findings, outline a number of pain points in the TCA reporting process. Accounting Services has made a number of improvements in the overall TCA process since 2020. However, we will continue to focus our efforts across the organization, providing increased training and support to divisions in their accounting treatment decisions, ensuring policy and processes incorporate PSAS and industry best practices, maximizing the use of technology, and enhancing details in our TCA records to support both financial reporting and asset management. Finally, accounting services teams are working closely with the FSTP project team to ensure that our future state incorporates all of these improvements and best practices. The 2023 and future statements will incorporate a number of new accounting standards. The most important for the city relates to the recognition of potentially significant asset retirement obligations, reflecting the value of legal obligations associated with the retirement of our infrastructure assets. The 2023 statements will also include a new statement supporting presentation changes in the valuation of the city's investments. This concludes our presentation on the 2022 financial statements. Similar to prior years, the 2022 statements are published in the city's annual financial report, which closes off the city's fiscal year and summarizes key financial and operational highlights. We encourage you to read the 2022 report when published. Many thanks to divisions across the city for their support of the year-end process and audit. KPMG continues to be an incredible partner, working with accounting services to enable a seamless and positive audit process and experience. And then finally, a heartfelt thank you to my entire team in accounting services for their hard work, professionalism, collaboration, and diligence throughout 2022. Special thanks, of course, goes to Jerry and Thaksha for not only partnering with me today, but for the leadership provided in managing the audit preparation, requests and requirements, particularly related to TCA findings, and the overall development of the city statements. Through their guidance, the improved disclosures made in our statements ensure full transparency of the city's year-end results. And then, of course, thank you to all of you for the opportunity to present today. We're happy to answer any questions that you may have.
And thank you to Thaksha and Jury, the whole accounting services team, KPMG, and of course, the whole finance and treasury services division for your presentation today. With that, I'll ask members of the committee if there's any questions. I do have one. And I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about the sinking funds. So in the report, it tells us that the value changed fairly significantly. I remember a number around $280 million, and then that was mitigated down to $180 million. Are we out of alignment with what other municipalities are experiencing elsewhere? And where does this lead us? And I'll throw one more question in there and I'll stop. Is just at what point should the audit committee become concerned with this? We've got to report it, but at some point we still have to look at the value of these investments.
Yeah. So do you want to cover this? Or do you want me to do it? Sure. I'll do it. Okay. Or do you want to do it? Sure. Okay. Okay. I'll give Jury the opportunity.
The city's sinking fund investments did see a change in the unrealized loss, resulting in the changes in market value of our investments. However, this trend was actually fairly consistent across the board. Last year, the equity market faced unfavorable conditions throughout the year. But starting from Q1 2023, we have seen the trends reverse. So this was a Canada-wide trend that we have seen. Thank you for the question.
Follow on is, I think we follow prudent investor standards. And so would you say our investments are okay, or can you answer that question? And do we have to begin to intervene as a council and a committee?
I think the one thing to remember with the sinking funds is that we're talking about what you saw is really accounting presentation. So the sinking funds are presented in the financial statements at their fair market value. So when the fair market value increases and you do that presentation, you're going to see an unrealized gain. And when it decreases, you're going to see an unrealized loss. Okay. So the investment board and our capital markets team are obviously following the prudent investor strategy, and obviously very involved in ensuring that the city's capital and the capital investments are actually increase or maintain their value or increase in value to be able to provide the funds required to pay off the debt. So the one thing that you do have to remember is, much like your own personal investments, you don't actually realize the gain or the loss until you sell them.
Right.
But when you look at it at a period in time, they might be higher or lower than when you purchased them at.
Okay. And that was December 31st, 2022.
Correct.
All right. And we are 6 months.
We're 6 months in, and yeah, we've actually disclosed in the sinking funds statements as a note that the value has actually overall recovered. So from a presentation perspective, it is starting to recover.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Any members wishing to speak? May I have a member move the recommendations?
I have a question.
Oh, hang on here. Councillor Myers, please go ahead.
Sorry.
No, not at all.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. So I did have a question regarding the increase in liquid funds. That just seemed counterintuitive to me, because from my understanding, the city's reserves have been depleted. So can you just provide an explanation as to, what are our liquid funds aside from the reserves, and where these would show up on the balance sheet?
Thank you for the question. So the city's reserves represent balances that, in accounting purposes, we call accumulated surplus. These are historical changes in our overall annual results that we accumulate over time. So the reserves, although they are mainly committed for future use, I would say that the liquidity that you're seeing on the balance sheet is slightly different. So what I wanted to mention is that the liquidity that we have in sustaining this year, as Thaksha mentioned earlier on in our presentation, was a deliberate, prudent practice that we maintained in order to ensure that we could quickly respond to COVID-related payments, as well as to, I guess, defer some of our capital investment decisions so that we could respond better in 2023.
If I may add, you also have to remember that the balance sheet is at a point in time. So the balance that you're looking at is at December 31st, 2022. That's not necessarily reflective of the balance of today.
Thank you. Understood. And are these liquid reserves, are they held in a separate account?
They're not held, they are
just-
not held in a specifically in a separate account. They're basically part of the city's overall cash balance, and they're managed on an overall, the city manages its cash on an overall basis relative to what's required to fund, to basically pay for things into the future.
From the fact that we had a budget presentation that showed a rather dire situation, and then you're showing that our liquid assets are actually increasing, which seems, you know, again, counterintuitive to what we've been told. So is this normal? Is this consistent with what we've been shown in the budget?
Yeah. It actually is, Councillor. The balances that are held in cash are actually they're all committed. So it just means that those expenditures are going to be made into the future. It doesn't mean that we've got liquid, you know, basically we call it, it's called a liquidity ratio because it is a measure of liquidity, but it does not mean that we have extra funds available. So that's why the balances have been maintained for the purposes of paying for things into the future that were obligations at in 2022.
Got it. So we might have liquid funds, but those liquid funds could already be spent or already be committed to other priorities.
Exactly.
Priorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? May I have a member of the committee move the recommendations, which is to recommend that City Council approve the three statements? Councillor Nunziata moves the staff recommendations. All those in favor, any opposed? That item carries. Item 2.2, the City of Toronto Audit Findings Report for the, thank you to staff for the presentation and the questions. AU 2.2 is the City of Toronto Audit Findings Report for the year ended December 31st, 2022. We do have guests. I would welcome Maria Kushnud and Kevin Travers, both from KPMG. Welcome to the podium. I know you're no stranger to the committee, and I'll ask you to begin whenever you're ready.
Thanks. Good morning. My name is Kevin Travers, lead audit partner from KPMG on the City of Toronto Audit. I am joined today by Maria Kushnud, another audit partner with the firm, also a key member of the team of the City of Toronto Audit. We're going to speak to our audit findings report and really just hit some of the highlights within the item that is included already within your agenda. We will be happy to respond to questions that you may have at the conclusion of the formal part of our presentation. I'll start by making a few comments with respect to overall audit highlights. Starting with the status of the audit. So as has been indicated already, our audit work has been completed. The only items outstanding at this point in time are completing our conversations with this committee this morning, understanding ultimately that Council has approved the financial statements, at which time we received the signed representation letter, and we will issue our signed unqualified audit opinion. With respect to significant changes year over year, we did adopt in the current period CAS 315, which is a new audit standard related to the identification and assessment of the possibility of material misstatement within the financial statements. That standard was implemented with no issues. In terms of performing our audit, we were able to perform our audit in accordance with the audit plan that was presented to this committee a few months back. Which included the work that was necessary on the significant components of the consolidated financial statements of the city. There were some uncorrected audit misstatements, which we will speak to in some detail later on. Ms. Calafretti also referenced them in her presentation. Management has represented to us, and we concur that these audit differences, both individually and in aggregate, are immaterial to the financial statements taken as a whole. With respect to control deficiencies, we did not note any control deficiencies which we would consider to be significant pervasive control deficiencies. We do have some observations and recommendations for improvement in systems. They will come forward to the next audit committee. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Maria, who will take you through the next part of our presentation.
Thanks, Kevin. So starting on page 9, so we've provided you with some detail on our procedures related to consolidation on page 9. The one item I would point out is pertaining to the exclusion of immaterial balances related to some of the smaller city agencies in the financial statements, consolidated financial statements for the city. The impact of these exclusions is slightly over our audit misstatement posting threshold, so we have reported an uncorrected adjustment related to that, but this is not significant or material for the purposes of the audited financial statements overall. The next page I would want to touch upon is page 12, where we talk about TCA, tangible capital assets. As noted on this slide, we have completed all required procedures related to tangible capital assets. We've also provided a conclusion that in aggregate, the differences that are noted in relation to TCA are not material for the purposes of our audit opinion for the consolidated financial statements. The audit adjustments can be grouped into 3 distinct areas. The first one pertains to reclassification between TCA and assets under construction and the impact on amortization due to that reclassification error. The second one pertains to gain on disposals being recorded in the incorrect period, so it's really based on when cash proceeds were received rather than when the closing of the agreement happened. It's a little bit of a cutoff issue. And the third issue pertains to incorrect expensing of capital assets, specifically related to land valuations for the real estate division. The error related to expenses also impacted our testing of expenditures. So there is an extrapolated error reported related to expenses as well. Our uncorrected adjustments are reported on page 17, which most of them we've covered, or all of them at this point. Pages 13 to 16 provide you with more detail on procedures on some of the other areas of the financial statements. Nothing significant really to note here. With that, I'll pass it back to Kevin.
Thanks, Maria. I'll just make a few concluding remarks, and then certainly Maria and I would be happy to respond to questions you have. With respect to the appendices within our document, the one item I do want to highlight is Appendix D, which references the accounting standard changes for future periods. And again, this was part of the presentation that you saw from the finance team already. The most significant item is the requirement to adopt a new standard called asset retirement obligations in your 2023 financial statements. And the comment that I want to make today to this committee is just to provide some comfort to members of the committee that we have commenced work with city management and team to begin the preparations necessary in order to adopt the standard as part of the 2023 financial reporting. And then just in conclusion, I do want to acknowledge and thank city management and the finance team for the assistance that they provided throughout the performance of the audit to get us to the position that we're at this morning. So that really represents the comments that Maria and I have, and we'd be happy to respond to any questions that you have.
Thank you to the team at KPMG. Questions of the auditor? I have one, I think it's a quick one. There's listed here is just the impact of unconsolidated entities. Can you give us some examples of what those entities are?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I think some of the items that you talked about earlier when we were talking about some of the arenas and some of those items, where from a timing standpoint and the effort required, it just makes sense to exclude those for the consolidated financial statements purposes. So when you add them all up, as Maria pointed out, they do exceed our threshold for reporting, but the effort that was required in order to complete the consolidation, when you added all those items together, was very excessive for a finance team, and also draws out the audit period itself. So when management brought that suggestion to us, we certainly were supportive.
How much money are we talking about?
I think the total net asset value, and it's listed, what is it, Maria, that we were talking about? So
It's 40 million, I believe, in total.
The effect on income, I think, was 10 million. So we're talking about 10 million on a $16 billion budget.
yes.
Yeah.
And so, just so I understand, a discussion was had, and I think KPMG agreed that the work effort required to bring those into the accounting without adjusting them is enormous, right? Because they're very, very small entities, and they all have their own financial statements.
Yes.
So that's why this shows, and perhaps we'll continue to see that in the future, but that's not because it's an error, it's because it's a decision.
Correct. I mean, technically, you are required to consolidate them, but as you can see, the effort greatly outweighs the added benefit from a financial reporting standpoint.
So you've noted it in the auditor's report for council.
Yes.
Great.
And
Thank you.
also because of the goal that the city has for acceleration of financial reporting, this would be
This will help.
supportive of that. Yep.
Okay. Any other questions? May I have a member of the committee move the recommendation? Anybody want to move? Anybody want to move the staff rec? Or the
Hi.
KPMG's rec?
Hello, hi.
Sorry, Councillor Myers? We're going to be patient here because there's a little bit of delay in the connection.
Sorry, I had a quick question regarding the changes to reference on appendix. So I'm looking and it says, consider how the additional liability impact net debt as a new liability will be recognized with no corresponding increase in a financial asset. Do we have a sense as to how this will affect our sort of debt ratio going forward? Will this be a material effect?
I'm just going to pause and I'll check. Did you get the question? Because the audio is not great.
Yes, we think we did.
Okay, go ahead.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So there will be a significant debt or obligation added to your balance sheet for 2023. We do not know exactly or even have an opportunity to suggest what that may be at this point in time. But there will be an added obligation for the city, and it relates to end-of-life obligation of various assets. So there's not necessarily an obligation that will be required to be satisfied in the very near period necessarily, but it will be more encompassing of the total obligations related to the remediation necessary at the end of your assets' lives.
So will this actually affect how much? Will this actually affect how much debt we can take on as a city? Additional debt, I mean.
So, Councillor, it's Andrew Flynn. The long-term debt that we're going to be able to ascertain is the debentures are limited by 15% of our own source revenue. This would not be considered a part of that calculation. So no, it would not impact our that ability.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. May I have someone from the committee move the recommendations? Thank you, Councillor Malik. Just going to get some clarity. So the recommendation is that City Council receive the report. Moved by Councillor Malik. All those in favor? Any opposed? That item carries. Okay, we are on to item AU 2.5, which is a review of the procurement and award of the winter maintenance performance-based contracts. And the first item I have here is an intro and remarks from Madam Auditor General. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you, Chair. So this audit was on the procurement and award of the winter maintenance contracts, which were awarded in December 2021 for nearly $1.5 billion over a 10-year term. There were deputations by unsuccessful suppliers and pre- and post-award bid disputes which raised concerns and questions about the processes to procure and award these contracts. And our fraud and waste hotline also received a number of complaints on this matter. So City Council voted to add this audit to our work plan to review the city's negotiated request for proposal process. And what we found is that these were atypical circumstances. So staff did not anticipate that so few suppliers would pass the technical proposal evaluation stage, and that for some contract areas, no suppliers would pass. Many of the challenges related to this procurement likely arose from the unexpected need for a second NRFP process, and subsequent non-competitive procurement. NRFPs is a non-binding procurement method which gives the city more flexibility to exercise its reserve rights and discretion than the traditional binding RFP format. We found overall that the city followed the process rules with regards to the NRFP. However, we did note some areas for continuous improvement to better support procedural fairness. We found that the NRFP rules and process and related evaluation guidelines could be made clearer, and some communication on the requirements could have been clearer and more consistent. We've identified additional areas for continuous improvement, including training client divisions on verifying past experience and operational capability of potential suppliers, as well as clarifying and strengthening procurement policies and procedures. We've also recommended that for complex, large-scale procurements such as this one, to test out significant changes to the procurement processes and contracting methods on a smaller scale first, and then review those lessons learned before implementing the large-scale changes. Implementing the 16 recommendations in our report will support the city's ongoing efforts to make the NRFP process rules clearer, with the goal of keeping as many suppliers as possible through all evaluation stages and achieving the best possible outcomes and value for the city. And I'd like to thank the management and staff of the Transportation Services Division, Purchasing and Materials Management Division, Legal Services, and the Office of the Controller. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just check, are there any other presentations or remarks prepared? I'm not aware of any, but before we go to questions, no, seeing none. Questions of staff? Councillor Malik, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that presentation. While I understand the supply chain issues and the lingering effects of the pandemic and the effects that they had on this issue, one area of increased concern for me was the following statement, and I'll just read it out. We could not verify that equipment arrived on time due to insufficient records of staff's physical verification of equipment at the depot and some daily rate sheets that did not have accurate information. Can you share with us a little bit more about what the nature of this problem was? Is it a problem of record keeping or a lack of staffing from the city?
So through the chair, that actually relates to our next agenda item on our follow-up review. Is it okay to, it's on 2.6. Is it okay if we answer it at that time?
Yeah, I think if it's all right, we'll include that together in that particular piece as it's part of your presentation. I know they're so close together.
Yeah.
And when you read these reports, they all gel together, but yeah.
It's okay, I'll answer it in the next, because we have a presentation on it too.
Yeah, we'll have time to talk about that one as well. I'm sure there'll be questions. Any other ones? Okay. Councillor Nunziata?
So to staff then, with the recommendations, the 16 recommendations that's brought forward today, so what are your comments on those recommendations, and do you support the recommendation?
Through the chair. We do support the recommendations. A lot of these recommendations are actually already in place and have begun. We're also currently in the reviewing phase of our purchasing bylaw. So a lot of these recommendations was also taken into account during this review.
Okay, so then can I ask the auditor, so with past year with this, with the snow removal, so in other words, we were not prepared?
Are you referring to the
Yeah.
follow-up review through the chair?
Well, I guess the procurement relates to it, so
Right.
you can answer it in that way.
On the next one, I have questions, yeah.
So through the chair, the procurement was completed in time, and it was actually the tight timeline that was part of the challenge. But I think I'd rather speak to the operations in the next item, if that's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Next one then, okay. Thanks.
Okay, and I know Councillor Myers let me know that he's experiencing some connection issues. Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna check with him if there's any questions, because I've got one. Yep, go ahead, Councillor.
Yes, I did have a question. So I was just curious as whether or not you got a sense as to, one, how many of the
Lost the audio.
moving to this new, like, was there good progress being made? Because I don't understand why we moved to this system when it doesn't seem like there was much benefit either to the city, as these contracts were more expensive and there were, a much more higher performance related issues with these new contracts.
They don't have staff on it.
Can we just recap the question?
So if I got the question right, Councillor Myers, because the audio is giving us trouble, I think you, and I'm going to paraphrase, you were asking why we moved to a different procurement model and a different contract design?
Exactly.
Okay, and that may be best for staff to answer, and we'll give Vince just a moment to get to the microphone.
Do you want me to start? Sure. Okay. Through the chair. Thanks for the question, Councillor. So the winter contracts that had been in place for some time did not provide the city a comprehensive tool for oversight and performance management. Was one of the main reasons why we looked to have performance-based contracts. Before putting the procurement together, we actually worked quite extensively with the auditor on what we could do to ensure that we were getting better value for money out of the next set of contracts. And so we went into the process with the goal of having more performance-based contracts, and also having the ability to have one contractor have oversight over all the winter maintenance components, and have fewer number of contracts to provide us with more of ability to oversee those contractors directly, and also have the challenges with rolling out winter maintenance, sidewalks, roads, windrow clearing, all of those components be the responsibility of one contractor in each geographic area. I don't know if you want to add.
Through the chair, so yeah, just a few other items I'll add. The previous contract structure had 47 different contracts. And I appreciate that this last winter season under the new structure, there were some issues with respect to performance and maintaining service levels. But the previous contracts, as the general manager has indicated, was not based on performance-based metrics. It was strictly an hourly-based contract, and there were equally, if not just as many more issues with the contractors and them providing services that did meet the council-approved service levels. And then from a management standpoint, managing 11 zones as opposed to 47 different contracts and trying to avoid or deal with the ongoing conflicts between the contractors was an objective that we were trying to achieve and still believe will occur with the 11 zones. And as the general manager said, this was actually one of the outcomes as a result of the previous Auditor General audits with respect to winter maintenance and having a more efficient contract management system for our staff.
Thank you. And is it normal to have these contracts over 10 years?
I didn't hear the question.
The question is it normal to have these contracts for 10 years?
Yes. Through the chair, yes, they are typically extended contract terms, and part of the reason for that is because the contractors are responsible for purchasing equipment, which amortizes over a longer duration. So this contract is actually set up for 7 years with the potential for a 3-year extension.
Thank you. And what was the risk consideration of just having one contractor rather than having multiple contractors, which would have provided more slack to the contracts?
So I didn't get that all, sorry.
Repeat that, Councillor Myers.
We went with one contractor, and it sort of was assumed that there would be no issues with one contractor, whereas if you have multiple contractors, yes, it could be more complex, but you have more slack in case one of the contractors is not performing. So here we had we had just a few contractors, and if one wasn't performing, it caused issues across the city.
So
So was that sort of factored into the risk analysis?
Through the chair, so thank you, Councillor. I think we've got it now. The 47 contracts were not duplicative in any one geographic area, so you actually had specific equipment that was for local roads, arterial roads, sidewalk clearing, and so while there were also written into those contracts, it was only in specific situations when we had a contractor, let's give an example, under the previous contract where a contractor went out of business, that we had to negotiate additional work with one of the other 47 contractors to cover off a different geographic area. But generally speaking, there was not shared work amongst those contractors in those geographic areas. And so that certainly was, I think you asked about the risk considerations. Certainly, there was not a different level of risk, I would say, between the previous contracts and this one. Is that fair?
Right, but under the previous model, let's say one contractor was not performing at all. It wouldn't sort of cause these systematic issues that we saw throughout the city, where if we had one contractor, it caused issues across the city. Was that not considered when we were sort of designing these contracts?
Thank you. Last question.
So through the chair, the procurement process that we established had multiple set of criteria to assess the viability or feasibility of the contractor. It was a two-envelope process. One was financial, and the other one was based on performance. Part of that did include a capacity to do the work to meet the service levels that we specifically identified. It also included experience working within a specific part of a jurisdiction like the City of Toronto. So there were many performance-based criteria that the bidders were all evaluated and scored to determine if, in fact, they were successful in passing and going to the next round. So performance, and they had to demonstrate that through documentation and also through contacts. We checked references that they had to, in fact, demonstrate their ability to do the work.
I would just also add through the chair that having fewer contractors really does allow the city staff to build stronger relationships and more effectively manage those contracts and provide that better oversight. And really, at the core of what we tried to do with the new winter contracts was to get to a place where our staff was able to efficiently and effectively and consistently monitor performance. And I think in the next report, when we talk a little bit more about that, I think we'll have the ability to show that we're on the path there. And certainly, I know as Councillor Malik provided some early questions, that there are still some issues that we are working through. And so I hope we can provide some clarity around that as well.
Thank you. Councillor Myers, if you can just let us know if you want to go to a second round, but that was, your question period is up. And I realize it might be harder to catch the clock working remotely. I did want to ask some questions.
Thank you, that's it.
Okay, I did want to ask some questions, but I'll check with my colleagues. Are there any others? No, so I'll ask some of my own. Can staff tell me what changed from the previous contracts to this one? So like, we didn't build any more roads. I don't think we changed what we asked the contractors to do. Like our performance requirements are the same. And yet it turned out to be much more expensive. Do you have any comments? Was there something else in the mix that might have driven this?
So through the chair, I'll start and then I'll turn it over to my staff as well. The biggest change between the last contracts and these ones is the fact that these were performance-based contracts. so that a contractor was ultimately compensated based on abilities to meet specific time requirements. So we had maximum operating time and also performance outcomes. The previous contracts did not have those specific requirements. It was primarily just an hourly-based contract, and contractors were paid essentially for services rendered per hour. So that is the biggest difference between the last series of contracts and this series. We do have additional infrastructure in these contracts that did not exist in the previous contracts, such as cycling infrastructure. The service level for cycling infrastructure was enhanced. There were more kilometers, different types of cycling infrastructure, and an increased level of service levels. For sidewalks as well, the previous contracts were not obliged to obtain a consistent service level across the city for sidewalk infrastructure. In this contract, every kilometer sidewalk must be maintained based on a singular enhanced service level. So those, along with many other factors that contributed to the costs of these contracts relative to the others, did generate higher bids. And I'll just turn it over to Carly Hanks, who's here with me right now, and she could also identify some of the impacts that resulted in higher costs relative to the previous contracts.
Yeah, thanks, Vince. Through the chair, I would also say that the last time we tendered the contracts was in 2014 for the 2015 season. So we do consistently see about a 30% increase in costs for inflation alone. When we did go out to the market, it was at a time when there was a global supply chain issue, and so that related to some costing issues as well. And I would suggest that we'll probably talk a little bit more about that in the next contract or in the next report. But I would suggest that those are some areas along with what Vince had suggested with new infrastructure types.
My time is a little tight here, so I'm going to put two questions on the table and then I'll let you respond. The first is, will council have a chance to think about what it is that we ask the contractors to do next time? In other words, what are our standards and asks? Because that's the thing that changed the price. So do we need to rethink that, or will we have the opportunity to rethink that? And then my second question is, can you talk to me a little bit about what happened in area 2-5? Because it's in the report. If I recall, the staff estimate, and I'd like to know how the staff got to the estimate of about $6 million, and the contract through the process came in at $26 million. Which is like a huge difference. And you talk to me about, performance and risk and so on. I'm not sure I understand how that moved from 6 to 26. And then we ultimately landed on a different supplier for a lesser amount. So if you could handle those two questions, I'd appreciate it.
Certainly. So I'll handle the first one as well, and I'll start the second one, and I'll turn it over to Carly. So for the first one, City Council has approved specific service levels for each infrastructure and for storm category types. So for instance, for salting of arterial roads, the service level is that they must be salted upon snow accumulation and completed within 4 hours, and it must be bare pavement. That's just an example, and there are a whole host of other type of service levels. The City Council approved service levels have to be aligned with the provincial government minimum maintenance standards for winter maintenance. So the province does regulate and dictate that municipalities must maintain a specific service level for winter maintenance. City Council approved service levels are all aligned, if not some do exceed the service levels for winter maintenance relative to the provincial government maintenance standards. City Council is always able to review service levels. And in fact, we did present a report back in 2019 where we came forward to this, to IEC and to City Council. where we did present our service levels and in fact change the service levels as it pertains to sidewalk maintenance. So that is always at the privy of City Council, but we must be aligned and consistent with provincial government maintenance standards for winter maintenance. So that's for the first one. For the second one, I'll just start that with respect to the cost, you may reference that. Insurance was probably one of the highest cost drivers relative to the last previous contracts to this winter contract. Insurance costs relative to 2014 to 2021 had escalated. I can't remember exactly, may have even been as much as 200%, but it was one of the biggest factors that all contractors had to essentially deal with and obtain. That was the most significant cost driver. And with respect to estimates relative to what we received, we did have a consultant provide staff with analysis on estimates for equipment and for potential costs that we used in determining if, in fact, the bids that we received were in scope with those estimates. So I don't know if there's anything else that Carly would like to talk about.
Yeah, through the chair, I would also suggest that we develop an estimate before we put out a procurement, and our estimate was comprised of equipment, the number of equipment that we would have based on information we had from the existing contracts, as well as a cost associated with that. That's what the evaluation team compared it to. And I would suggest that, given, as you've heard, we've changed the type of the contract. This was the first time that the estimate was tested since we changed the structure of the program. And so that could be part of the, the lessons learned that we would take for future contracts is to build some of that stuff in.
Thank you. I'll just check with the committee. Are there any further questions on this item? Councillor Nunziata?
So, Vince, when you mentioned insurance, and so the reason for, it's on. It's on. So, does that insurance, is that for damages?
Through the chair, that's one of the components of insurance that, yes, the contractors must obtain, along with other types of insurance for the staff and for their equipment. But property damage is one element of the insurance. And many insurance providers were no longer willing to provide insurance for these type of services, not just for Toronto, but across Ontario, across Canada. It is a problematic, difficult service to provide, and they recognize that with that comes an element of risk. And that risk, one of the risks is property damage. So yes, that's one part of it.
Okay, so that one part of it, do you have an estimate of how much that portion is for damages out of the increase? Like millions or?
I don't believe we had a breakdown aggregate of what the insurance component was, how much was specifically for property. It was just a aggregate number.
Blanket insurance. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Are there any members wishing to speak?
Councillor Holliday, sorry to interrupt you, but we had another answer with response to your discrepancy in the dollar amount between the 26 and the 6 that we wanted to add.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, through the chair, the 26 million was not what the city awarded at. That was one of the bids that came in. The city actually awarded that contract area at 17 million. And it was done through an NCP because we got a better price.
Thank you. Any members wishing to speak?
Can I ask another question?
Okay, second round, Councillor Myers. Go ahead.
So regarding that price of the contractor who came in with a bid at $26 million, can city staff just further explain as to why they didn't pursue negotiations with that contractor? And I have a second question. Does the staff have any sense as to how our costs compare to other cities? Because I'm trying to figure out like how much of this cost driver increase was due to COVID versus switching to this new contract system. Thank you.
Yeah, through the chair, and so I think I heard all of that, but what I can suggest is that we, from a holistic perspective, across all industries, we saw an increase in bidding as a whole. And with respect to the decision to cancel the contract area based on a number of factors. The evaluation team took into consideration the estimate, how close it was to the estimate, as well as the number of pieces of equipment that were also quoted in the bid. And they were significantly off, which is why the team as a whole chose not to go with that.
And with respect to the second part of the councillor's question, what do our costs look like compared to other municipalities? I don't have that cost here really available. I'd have to research that. But having said that, Toronto's costs will likely be higher simply because the City of Toronto provides the most elaborate, the most sophisticated, and most complicated services for winter maintenance probably in all of Canada. Outside of perhaps Montreal, which Montreal does more snow removal because of the amount of snow they receive. But for instance, with the exception of Vaughan and City of Toronto, no other municipality in Ontario provides driveway windrow clearing. The City of Toronto is the only city that does that. Mississauga recently assessed that and voted against it. So our costs will likely be higher, but again, it's a question of trying to compare apples to apples. Toronto's infrastructure is much more challenging, much more different, and as a result, we do require our contractors to provide more services, more suite of services than, again, without the exception of Montreal, than any other jurisdiction.
And through the chair, I would also like to add, most other cities and municipalities, they actually have a two-tiered approach to this. They have the region that actually does the higher order roads, as well as the municipality only does the local roads, whereas in the City of Toronto, we have a live-in component that addresses the expressways that most other municipalities don't have, as well as all the other higher order roads that are not included in most municipalities.
Thank you. Councillor Myers, was that everything? And thank you, Councillor. We just know the audio is a bit broken up, so that's why I just want to check with you before we go to speakers. Okay, I think we'll go to speakers. Anyone wishing to speak on this item? No. May I have someone move the auditor's recommendations, please? Councillor Nunziata moves the auditor's recommendations. All those in favor? Any opposed? And that carries. Okay, we will go to the next item, which is AU 2.6. I'll just read that out. This is, again, winter maintenance, program follow-up, status of previous Auditor General's recommendations and processes to hold contractors accountable to new contract terms. Madam Auditor General, you have a presentation for us, and please proceed when you're ready.
Okay, we'll get started. Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to start off by thanking and acknowledging my team, Aina Chan, Deputy Auditor General, Nira Movchevich, Audit Director, Rashir Patel, Senior Audit Manager, Daniel Du, Audit Manager, and Vivian Chen, Audit Analyst. And Rashir Patel will be presenting with me today. So during our brief presentation today, We'll highlight why this follow-up review matters, a bit of background, the progress or overall follow-up results, as well as the challenges, key findings by area, and closing remarks. So winter maintenance services are important as they affect our safety and mobility. Contracted winter maintenance services are part of the city's snow and ice management plan that is designed to prioritize the safety and mobility of all road, sidewalk, cycle, and path users. Nearly $1.5 billion in winter maintenance contracts over a 10-year term were awarded in December 2021. And City Council voted to have the Auditor General review the terms of the new winter maintenance contracts against our previous Auditor General recommendations and transportation services processes to hold winter maintenance contractors accountable to the contract terms. The reviews were incorporated into our follow-up of the 26 recommendations in our 2 previous Auditor General reports on the winter maintenance program. This follow-up assessed whether management's actions in the context of the new contracts for 2022 to 2032 addressed the intent of the previous recommendations. As part of this new contract cycle, there have been some major changes. These new contracts, as we just discussed, are performance-based. There are 11 contract areas versus 47 before, and 5 contractors versus 21 before. Contractors now service all infrastructure types, so roads, sidewalks, bike lanes, and perform all activities, plowing, salting, etc. Contractors are also now responsible for determining the number and types of equipment required, and they plan the routes to ensure services are performed to contracted service levels. Transportation Services continues to be responsible for monitoring performance and holding contractors accountable. This responsibility, I would say, is even more important now with the performance-based contracts, as there are related price adjustments to be applied based on the required service levels. So in terms of progress, Transportation Services has made progress. They've improved the clarity of contract language. So for example, liquidated damages, stop and break times, and responsibility for working GPS. They've developed a winter maintenance contract administration manual, which includes 32 standard operating procedures and forms and checklists, and trained their staff on the manual in December 2022 and January 2023. The division has also piloted a purpose-built GPS dashboard in February 2023 for monitoring service levels and contractor performance. There have also been some major challenges. There were supply chain challenges due in part to the COVID-19 pandemic, which impacted the availability of equipment and timing of arrival at depots, resulting in equipment substitutions and delays in installing GPS devices. There were resource and staffing challenges, which impacted the number of operators available to operate winter equipment. And there were administrative setbacks and technology gaps, which caused delays in integrating the new Enterprise Work Management System, or EWMS, with existing processes and in configuring the GPS dashboard for the first winter season. So in terms of our overall follow-up results, we verified that 10 out of our 26 recommendations are fully implemented, and 1 is no longer applicable under these new contracts. There is work underway in the remaining recommendations, and 15 recommendations remain to be fully implemented. We've also included 4 new recommendations in this report to help Transportation Services improve its policies and processes to hold contractors accountable to the new contract terms, and management agrees with all of the recommendations. Going forward, we found that Transportation Services needs to strengthen its processes to consistently enforce payment criteria and apply liquidated damages. And I'll now pass it over to Rashir to provide our key findings in this first area.
Thank you, Madam Auditor General. I'll now discuss the daily rates. For equipment to be paid a daily rate, there are 2 primary requirements. The equipment should be available on site and have a working GPS device. Daily rate sheets require staff to indicate yes or no for whether the listed piece of equipment should receive the daily rate. If staff indicated yes to daily rates, it would imply they physically verified the equipment and it was on site. However, we could not verify that the equipment arrived as scheduled, as the staff did not retain sufficient documentation of physical verification. Some daily rate sheets did not have accurate information. For example, staff indicated that equipment had a functioning GPS device, however, GPS data showed otherwise. More specifically, GPS data showed that on December 1st, 2022, GPS devices on 191 pieces of equipment had no GPS signal. Staff had incorrectly marked those GPS devices as working. Next slide, please. This slide discusses the equipment that did not always have the functioning GPS devices installed. We noted that 285 equipment took anywhere between 1 to 4 months before a GPS signal was available. 105 equipment did not have GPS signal at the end of the winter season, and 367 sensor installations were still outstanding. Management paid daily rates as long as equipment could be deployed. We estimate that transportation services paid almost $18 million for 633 pieces of equipment where we observed that GPS device did not appear to be active in the GPS system. This slide discusses daily rates on the substitute equipment. For the year 2022-23, 204 pieces of equipment were substituted. A majority of pieces were substituted by the joint venture, which had to acquire all of the equipment it proposed. Change orders are still being processed for about 70 pieces of equipment. Most substituted equipment were paid the rate of original equipment instead of the lower rate for the substituted equipment type in the contractor's original contract proposal. For example, if triaxle was replaced with tandem axle, the contractor was still paid for triaxle, even though rates for tandem were lower on the same contractor's proposal. We estimated the potential impact to be at least $1.3 million over the first winter season. The next slide discusses the liquidated damages clauses. There are 10 liquidated damages clauses in the contract. We found that process to verify contractors' work was highly manual, time intensive, because GPS dashboard and various other exception reports were not ready. As a result, staff found it to be very time consuming to calculate potential liquidated damages and price adjustments. Procedures to verify that the contractor completed their assigned work within the stipulated time period can be improved and be made more consistent across 11 contract areas. We also found no liquidated damages were applied from the month October 2022 to January 2023, and from February 2023 onward, 2 of the 10 liquidated damages clauses were applied, and this focused on the performance issues. Transportation services have so far issued $17.4 million in liquidated damages for 2 clauses. One is for late start, and the other for not correcting deficiencies within the required time frame. I'll now turn over to Madam Auditor General for the next slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashir. So the second key area for improvement is on ensuring robust monitoring of contractor performance. If you recall, in our Phase 1 audit of the winter maintenance program, many of our recommendations related to improving the monitoring and management of contractor performance. We also recommended that technology using the GPS data be leveraged so that staff could easily perform this monitoring. And although Transportation Services piloted a new GPS dashboard and new EWMS system, neither system was fully functional in time for the first winter season, which meant that staff were manually monitoring, and as Rashir mentioned, it is a very time-intensive exercise. Staff we interviewed advised us that they are not consistently using the deficiencies functionality in EWMS to record potential contractor deficiencies, and as a result, that data is incomplete. We also noted an average of 3 field audit reports per contract area completed by patrollers for each winter event day compared to the 20 specified in the contract and manual. And when they were performed, they were not always well documented. This is an important part of monitoring contractor performance to measure whether service levels have been achieved. The performance-based contracts allow for both negative and positive price adjustments based on contractors achieving the service levels. There were $300,000 in negative price adjustments applied for this first winter season, and these related to 2 contract areas, both servicing Scarborough for 2 to 3 winter events. The third key area for transportation services is to continue implementing systems and tools to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of contract management. Before the next winter season, transportation services should ensure its GPS dashboard and exception reports are fully functional and ready, and that its remaining GPS devices and sensors are installed and functioning, as well as continuing to integrate its processes with EWMS. So in summary, there has been progress since our 2020 and 2021 audits. We verified that 10 recommendations have been fully implemented. However, there is more work to be done. 15 of the recommendations have work underway but remain to be fully implemented. And we've included 4 new recommendations in this report. So in terms of the areas for continued improvement, they are strengthening processes to consistently enforce payment criteria and apply liquidated damages, ensuring robust monitoring of contractor performance, and continuing to implement systems and tools to improve efficiency and effectiveness of contract management. I'd like to thank the management and staff of the Transportation Services Division, as well as the Fleet Services Division. Thank you. I'm now going to turn it over to our colleagues at Transportation Services for their management presentation.
Team, we'll just pause for just a moment as we change over. Team from Transportation Services, and whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Barbara Graham, the General Manager of Transportation Services, and I'll be doing the presentation this morning with Vince Ferrazza, who's the Director of Operations and Maintenance. I want to thank the Auditor General and her team for their ongoing involvement in helping us to guide continuous improvement in what is an incredibly complicated and very large-scale winter services program. You have the slides? Yep. Okay, I'm going to go to the, there we go. In 2020, we embarked on a major transformation of our winter maintenance program, and we did that incorporating the guidance from a report that the Auditor General's Office had put together to give an overview of what they believed was lacking in the previous program and where they thought we could strengthen both performance and value for money. We've been working collaboratively with the Auditor General's Office on this report. We will continue this important collaboration going forward. We believe we're at the beginning stages of continuous improvement of winter service. I think we've made a very significant leap forward this year, but we all recognize that we have more to do, and we endorse and support the recommendations in the report, as well as the 4 new recommendations and the 15 that are currently in progress. Madam Auditor went over a number of these pieces of our winter contract accomplishments for the 2022-23 season. So there were a number of new contract preparations, as well as some foundational technology improvements that were put in place. And I really want to emphasize that part. We onboarded an enterprise work management system last year. It was the first time that we ever had an enterprise work management system to manage winter. We also worked very collaboratively with our colleagues at 311 to ensure the first steps to the integration of that with Salesforce, because we know that the community is very interested in the progress around snow management in the city, rightfully so. We also were plagued with a number of frontline vacancies, as the Auditor General mentioned, as were the contractors. We did, however, manage to hire 175 new staff, a lot of them having to do with our sidewalk plows in the downtown, our new sidewalk maintenance program. And then we also developed and delivered significant training for staff on winter. This is really the beginning of that journey. We certainly, the auditor mentioned that we developed 32 standard operating procedures. And in addition to that, we also had the setup of the winter maintenance depots for all the new contractors that came on board. So it was a very, very significant and heavy lift for our team, the fleet team, our colleagues at 311, as well as the contractors. And as the Auditor General also mentioned, we did get a number of foundational pieces in place, including the GPS dashboards, including equipment, and we did have to make some decisions along the way about how to deliver that service when all the pieces were not necessarily in place. And so the only other thing that I would mention here about our accomplishments is we did a pretty significant upgrade to Plow TO, and I want to give some thanks to our colleagues at Technology Services for advancing and escalating that work. Plow TO is an interface that connects with the sensors on the equipment and provides a public-facing dashboard so that people can see where the equipment is in the city and how it is performing vis-a-vis their location. And so that program has been significantly upgraded this year, and we'll continue to make improvements to that as well. So on to the next. As the auditor mentioned, we had a lot of challenges, some which were within our control and some which were not. So the global supply chain and labor shortages were a huge impact on getting winter services up and running this year, not only for us, but also for the contractors. And then before I turn it over to Vince, I did want to flag that we have a pretty significant team, internal staff team that oversee and manage winter and operations and maintenance. That team went from really a paper-based program to a technology-based program in the span of under one season, and there are lots of there's lots of room for improvement there. We have training. There's a lot of consistency that we're focused on. Transitioning that program, as Councillor Myers mentioned in his previous questions, from 11 to 47, while giving us the tools to be able to monitor and oversee those contracts more specifically, is still quite a departure from what staff had to oversee previously. Moving to a performance-based contract is an entirely new way of doing business for us. And so all of that does require some time to get people consistent and up to speed on how to do that work. We also know that our technology is only going to get better. As we mentioned, we have some foundational pieces in place, but it is not yet working at its full extent, and we are busily working over the summer to be prepared for this winter season. We also had a number of compressed timelines with contractors, with consultants to help us get these systems in place. And again, just saying that a major business process change was required, and that does take some time to be sustainable. So with that, I'll turn it over to Vince to cover a few other pieces.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the issues that the Auditor General had identified in her report, specifically around the equipment and also liquidated damages. So as the Auditor General indicated, there were significant supply chain issues that resulted in the vendors being unable to acquire the originally proposed equipment. And in many cases, that occurred during the latter part of their actual procurement. So manufacturers, unfortunately, were unable to provide the full suite of equipment that the contractor had purchased. And as opposed to simply trying to do as much as they could with what they had, we had an opportunity to work with the vendors to, in fact, replace that equipment with substitutive equipment. So to give you an example, if a contractor was purchasing 20 tandem trucks and they could only receive 10, the manufacturer were unable to provide all 20. Working with the vendor, we were able to at least replace the 10 that were unable to be delivered with other type of equipment. And that other type of equipment, which we refer to as substitute, would still be able to provide the service that the original pieces of equipment would do so. So that was a priority for us, that if they could obtain substitute equipment, that it had to meet the same services as the original equipment. But having said, though, when they presented that with us, we know that that may have some cost implications. Some of the substitute equipment would be new, or it would be a different type of equipment altogether. And as a result, it would have different costs associated with it. The purchase of the substitute equipment was many months after the original procurement for equipment was placed. And again, there were still the impacts of the pandemic where costs were going up. But having said all that, I want to assure this committee that there was no additional cost for the substitutive equipment. The daily rate and the operating that was applied would still be in accordance with what the bidder had submitted to the city. So that was a situation where we worked together and we provided an innovative solution to a very difficult circumstance where, again, manufacturers were unable to provide all of the equipment that was originally procured. With respect to liquidated damages, as the Auditor General indicated, there were inconsistencies amongst how liquidated damage was applied during this winter season, and that we did not issue liquidated damages at the outset because we wanted, first and foremost, to ensure that services would be provided to residents in the City of Toronto. Our priority was to ensure that streets, sidewalks, cycling infrastructure would be cleared. And while in fact a certain criteria such as a functioning GPS device on the equipment was not being fulfilled, that piece of equipment could still be able to service effectively the particular infrastructure that it was assigned to clear. Having said that, we did start applying the liquidated damages in February, recognizing that there were the original challenges and hurdles, some outside of the control of the contractor, were being addressed, and we were now at a point where we started to apply liquidated damages to deal specifically with performance. So moving forward, I just want to reiterate that we are fully implementing the tools and technology to support staff managing the winter contracts. One of the most significant improvements is the development of a GPS dashboard, which will monitor in real time service level achievement. So this dashboard, which we did pilot in February, and we were able to determine where in fact there was still room for improvement, will help our staff in real time determine if in fact a piece of equipment is servicing a particular infrastructure, whether it be a street, whether it be a sidewalk, or whether it be cycling infrastructure. And it will also provide multiple reports on whether it's meeting the service level times, and if in fact there are any issues or concerns with that particular equipment as it's delivering the service. The dashboard will provide alerts to staff, exceptional alerts, in the event that there is an issue that is materializing during an activation. Barbara's already mentioned that we have implemented a new enterprise work management system, and that will be further enhanced this coming winter season. We have developed for our internal review a service request dashboard, which will provide our staff with detailed information on service requests as it pertains to the type of service request and where the service request is occurring. So it will include everything from heat maps, it will include priority setting and so forth. And this will help our staff identify if in fact there are key areas within the city that may be experiencing issues as a result of the contractor's performance. And we are working over the spring and summer resolving the equipment issues with respect to GPS installation. I can say that all of the permanent equipment is all delivered, and they will all be fitted with the GPS devices. In fact, we're at a point now where practically 99% of all of the equipment has been installed with GPS devices. And throughout the spring and summer, in fact, we've already started having discussions with the contractors to resolve issues and lessons learned. And I can say that some of the improvements that we expect the contractor to implement for this next winter season will be, and they'll include automated in-vehicle routing systems, dash cameras, improved communications between city staff and contractor staff, and operational and beat improvements. And these will be ongoing throughout the summer. Internally, we are also looking at our manual, which had the 32 standard operating procedures. We have one winter season under our belt, and we realize that, in fact, there's still an ongoing need to clarify roles and responsibilities as it pertains to our staff. We will be implementing an internal compliance monitoring system to ensure that staff understand what their levels of expectations are. And we will be establishing for winter events a winter command center to track and monitor the performance during each winter event. With respect to communications, we will continue our coordination with 311. Ongoing public information, we ran a rather comprehensive public education campaign last year. And we will continue with our engagement with the counselor and counselor staff, having workshops, providing winter service binders, and having opportunities to engage with the counselor prior, during, and after each event. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before we start questions, I'm just going to check if there needs to be a change of seats. Okay. Councillor Malik, I have you first. I think all the councillors have questions, but we'll just get started in a sec. Councillor Malik, questions of staff.
Thank you. You heard my question earlier, and the concern was raised particularly in the statement. We could not verify that equipment arrived on time due to insufficient records of staff's physical verification of equipment at the depot and some daily rate sheets that did not have accurate information. I wanted to hear more about whether this is a problem of record keeping or a lack of staffing from the city, and what changes need to be addressed to remedy this issue.
Thank you, and through the chair. So we did find that there was record-keeping issues, so staff advised that they did physically verify at the contract milestone dates, but we were unable to verify because it was not documented. And they did refer to the daily rate sheets, but then, as mentioned during our presentation, we did find issues with the reliability of those daily rate sheets. So we were not able to conclude on that. So I don't know if management wants to talk about action plans on that.
Thank you. Yes, so I just want to reiterate that, as the Auditor General indicated, we were able to physically visit each of the sites and to verify that the equipment, in fact, had arrived, and that it arrives in accordance with 3 specific milestone dates, because not all the equipment has to be in the yard at the same time. There's 3 specific dates: October 15th, November 7th, and December 1st. And in fact, we did that, but as Auditor General has indicated, there were inconsistencies amongst our staff with respect to how to document that. We do have a standard operating procedure for that, and we do have a form that we realized that perhaps staff were confused or perhaps not as familiar with it, so that we will be retraining staff and in fact making some tweaks to ensure that documentation as it pertains to this specific issue is effectively and properly completed. So in one respect, satisfied that the equipment arrived, but we do need improvement with respect to having consistency amongst the city. We have found that many parts of the city, in fact, did provide that level of documentation. Unfortunately, others may not have not. As Barbara indicated, is a transformational change going from the 47 contracts to 11, but we are certainly going to ensure that our staff are properly trained and in fact make that documentation.
And through the chair, I just wanted to add, Councillor, when we reorganized a number of years ago, we created a business performance unit to provide a centralized compliance function as one of the pieces that they do. And we are actually, we have started to really do internal compliance to ensure that staff are being properly trained, the questions are being answered, and that we have some internal ability to monitor and track that on a regular basis.
Thank you. Councillor Nunziata.
Okay, so just on this equipment, Wouldn't we have known way in advance of the winter if we had the proper equipment or not? It doesn't make sense to me. If the contractor didn't have the proper equipment, was there some sort of penalty? Because we paid the contract for service and on their equipment, so I doesn't make sense.
I'll just start through the chair. In many cases, the equipment that the contractor ordered did not get fulfilled. Their orders did not get fulfilled. So they made, if you remember, the council took the action, gave us the authority to enter into the contract negotiations in January, I think, or December of last year of 2021. And so the contractors had a relatively short lead time to be able to procure that equipment. So they ordered all of the equipment that was required. Not all of it came in, and that's where we got into the discussions with them about substitutions to be able to provide the same level of service with different equipment as a temporary substitution until those orders could be fulfilled.
So are we sure that they did provide the same level of service without that equipment?
Right. Through the chair, yes, that was one of our requirements, is that, okay, if there was going to be temporary equipment in place in lieu of the permanent equipment arriving, that service that the original equipment was to provide would in fact still be able to be done by the temporary equipment or a substitute equipment. Absolutely. So that's just one of the areas that we understand. We appreciate that may be considered one of the reasons why performance was not as what it should have been. But having said that, I can say that the contractors were unfortunately not be providing by the manufacturers clear dates of delivery. These were issues outside of their control. What we did with the contractor to still provide a service with these temporary pieces of equipment, substitute equipment, was to at least maintain a certain performance rating so that the work would get done.
Okay, so you know that we received a lot of complaints last winter, right? A lot of complaints and a lot of damages done to private property as well. Actually, there was a report that went through Etobicoke York Community Council on the number of damages, and that where in fact the contractor has not repaired as of yet. And councillors are not given an update on these damages and when would they be repaired. But with all these complaints that came in, it wasn't really the complaint because of the equipment as much as the training for the contractors really not doing their job properly, like plowing a road and throwing snow, not clearing windrows, and residents have come out to shovel their sidewalks or their driveways, and then we come along and throw snow back into it. I mean, that's all proper training. It's nothing to do with equipment. It's that they weren't properly trained on certain parts of the city. Am I correct?
Through the chair, I would say that there were, with any new contract, when you're bringing on new staff, sometimes you get repeat staff who came from previous contracts who are knowledgeable of the area. And I think you'll probably recognize, Councillor Nunziata, that that's part of the issue, is you have to kind of understand the beats and have some understanding of providing that work in that geography, because our geographies are quite different across the city. And so certainly there was some inconsistency about how contractor staff approach that work, but the contractors are also very involved in training and trying to get consistency. They're in the process now of filling positions for this next winter season, and so we are all working very diligently on training. I did want to go back just to on the equipment piece. There was also the situation where the equipment was present, but the documentation didn't necessarily correspond, or it came in right before the milestone check-in date. Contractors weren't always clear, indicating from their vendors on delivery dates as well. But it's also important to note that the substitute equipment issues were all addressed well after the initial negotiations for the RFP were done. So that was all completed, and that's when we made those changes based on necessity, not because, just based on necessity.
Question, so when are the damages of the contractors that are still outstanding, are we going to be getting a list of when the repairs will be done? So constituents are waiting for months for damages on private property from our contractors?
So through the chair, with respect to property damage, I would just also like to elaborate that the issues surrounding damages to sod and other property is a result of many different factors. We did not have a very cold December, in November and December. And as a result, there was more property damage as a result that the sod was still very malleable, still very soft. And it wouldn't take much to have a blade just nick the sod and there would be damage. Along with also the fact that there's also many encroachments during a beat, whether it be retaining walls, whether it be in the landscaping, that does contribute to the difficulty and challenges of operating a sidewalk machine that may result in property damage. And this is not necessarily exclusive to this last winter season, but throughout many winter seasons. With respect to the repairs started in May. And I could say that for the most part, they are effectively completed. One of the issues still was obtaining supply, sod. Sod was just not readily available in May. And we had to wait until the sod farmers essentially were able to provide that supply to us and our contractors to make those repairs. So we have been working earnestly since May and continue to do so, but I can say that they are making great strides in making those repairs.
Thank you. Councillor Myers.
Thank you. I did sort of want to follow up with where Councillor Nunziata was going, because I was getting complaints as the chair of the Accessibility Committee. I was getting complaints not only about damage to property, but people damaging their scooters, their electric wheelchairs, because the snow plows weren't cleared or the sidewalk or the roads weren't cleared. So, you know, sort of on this whole issue of training, you know, some of it was just common sense. You looked at how they plowed the road, and they would plow windrows into the middle of the road, and then the windrows would freeze and create like very dangerous conditions. So I'm just wondering, like, what assurances do we have that this is not going to happen again, where the contractors are actually creating dangerous conditions, especially for people with disabilities, seniors, and people accessing TTC stops?
Through the chair, thanks, Councillor Myers. No, we absolutely believe there's significant room for improvement in the situations you're describing. I will say that part of the challenge with sidewalks in particular, and this has been an issue we've been trying to get improvement on over a number of years, especially for people with disabilities, because it is such a challenge for people to be able to get out of their homes during a winter storm. And many of those sidewalk plow operators typically get called out overnight when the light conditions are quite low, and often with a new snowfall, there's not a lot of boundaries on either side. So that's also part of the reason why those particular beats are challenging. With regard to the pushing of amounts of snow into the middle of roads, Vince mentioned that we are having ongoing conversations all summer long with the existing contractors to deal with lessons learned. We had similar issues, I don't believe as much in your ward, but certainly in Councillor Carroll's ward and others around the plowing of crescents. And so really some of those pieces we've noted, we've defined, we've asked for different procedures from the contractors, and we will be monitoring quite closely for that to make sure we have a more satisfactory outcome this year.
And thank you. And aside from applying liquid damages, what else do we have? Like, let's say the contractor isn't performing again this year. Are we sort of expecting residents to just sort of put up with poor snow plowing for the second consecutive year, or do we have some sort of contingency in place where if the contractor isn't performing in certain parts of the city, we can either send our own plows, like are we looking at purchasing additional plows, or having some sort of contingency plans in place for these specific instances when the contractor isn't performing properly? Because that was the other big issue where some parts of the city, the contractors were quite busy. Other parts, the contractors weren't busy. And from what I was told is we couldn't send those contractors who were idle to the parts of the city where they were needed because of the contract. So what have we figured out to solve that problem?
So through the chair, so our first line of attack is to ensure that the issues don't come up to begin with. And as Barbara said, we are now working with the contractors to improve training. One of the issues is ensuring that the staffing challenges that occurred last winter season are addressed as much as they can. So for instance, many of the staff that were able to stay on have been kept on throughout the spring and summer to do summer work for the contractor so that they will continue to be working with that contractor through the winter maintenance. And the intent is to ensure that they stay on a singular area, a singular beat, so that they become familiar with that neighborhood and all of the circumstances that pertain to that neighborhood. So they are and will be very soon starting to do dry run trainings where they'll be physically driving through many of the neighborhoods so that they become familiar with the nuances of those communities. So the first part of attack is to make sure that it doesn't happen again. In terms of if there are ongoing issues, I'm implementing also some changes with respect to how we address our service requests and how they become prioritized. So we're going to be ensuring that our staff understand exactly where the areas of deficiencies are and how they could be addressed sooner than later. And then the last thing I'll just simply say is that the contracts do allow for us to approach another contractor to assist in a different zone if the capacity exists within that contractor. So we do have that flexibility within the existing agreement where there could be some support or assistance requested in the event that it is required.
I also just wanted to add, Councillor
identified
Myers.
those contractors?
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add also that Vince mentioned technology, but I think to your point, and we had this conversation a number of times last year, is not waiting until something becomes a problem before it's being addressed. And I think one of the reasons why we're very optimistic about the dashboard is that it will give us that indication in advance when things aren't being completed appropriately so that we can be more proactive as opposed to having to wait till residents call in with complaints to address it.
Councillor Myers, did you have more questions? Because we're over time.
I did.
Okay, so I'll propose that we'll come back and we'll do another round, and we'll accommodate those if that's okay. Great. If I may, I'm going to ask a couple of my own, because I guess it's my turn. The first question I had for staff was, the Auditor General's report mentioned that there was substitutions of equipment. We understand why the equipment wasn't ready. Say, I think I saw a single axle vehicle was used in place of a double axle vehicle. Can you give the Audit Committee assurance that we didn't ultimately pay the daily rate for the larger piece? In other words, did we get the charges we paid discounted because the equipment wasn't there, even if it was for a reason?
So the first thing I just wanted to say with respect to all of the substitute equipments, the ones that did come in, we did work within the procurement rules, and that change orders that document exactly the substitute equipment were established and completed. And in those, the change orders were prices, were costs. And those costs we ensured were aligned with what the original bid costs were. Recognizing that, in fact, You give the example of a single axle. While it may have the same cost associated as the tandem, there were reasons behind that. And we did have verification from the contractor of why the costs were different. And those were submitted to within the change order. So as I indicated in the presentation, that the costs are not higher for that single axle relative to the tandem. It's the same daily rate as the tandem would be obtaining, or would be receiving. And that's where we made sure that it was aligned. It may not have the same cost of what the single was purchased a year ago, but there were circumstances to defend why that cost was different.
So hang on here. I want to make sure I understand this. In the case where a smaller truck was substituted for a larger truck, because the vendor said, look, I can't get the bigger one.
Right.
Did we pay less, or did we pay equal, or did we pay more?
We did not pay more. We did not pay more. In some cases, it was less. In some cases, it was equal.
So why would it be equal if it isn't the right size piece of equipment?
It was equal for many reasons, as I indicated in the presentation. One, the cost of that single was essentially equivalent to what the cost was of a tandem a year later. The cost associated with who would be operating that, whether it would be a live-in operator or a call-in operator, which have different costs associated with it as well. So there were specific drivers on why that price would be assigned, essentially the rate that it would of a tandem.
Adding together all of the net changes, and you said they were documented, they were change orders, I guess. Did we end up paying more or less for those daily rates on the overall
We did not
contracts?
pay more, we paid equally, we essentially paid equally.
Okay. Liquidated damages, I think, if I read correctly in here, can be charged May 31st on repairs that are not made. I think that's repairs to right-of-way or private property. I'm going by memory here. Is that correct? May 31st?
I'm sorry?
Is there did I read this correct? There's a liquidated damage charge for repairs that are not made to damaged property by May 31st. Is that one of the liquidated damage?
Yes, so through the chair, there is a liquidated damage associated with maintenance of a damage. However, the agreement does allow for flexibility with respect to that deadline in the event that there are circumstances such as the supply of sod, if it is available or not, and that then is documented through exchanges between city staff and the contractor.
Are we able to still levy liquidated damages if the time drags on beyond something that you've agreed to with, say, respect to sod? Because I think everyone understands that.
Right. Yes, that opportunities always exists.
All right. I wanted to ask one last question because that's all the time I've got. Just with respect to 311, we know that there's a period of which residents are locked out from filing a concern during a major snow event. And at times that can be frustrating because it's kind of like those days where the garbage truck goes down the street and they miss your bin, and 311 will tell you, look, you can't call back till after 6 because theoretically they have still within their service window, and you say, but the truck went by. We all know it's not coming back. Does the contract management in this report, or do we have plans to get to a stage where we will be able to open up more for complaints, especially to deal with those cases where people know something is wrong? Is there a plan for the future for that?
To you, Chair, there's ongoing modifications and improvements that we're making with regard to providing better information to customers through 311. And we can talk a little bit more about that if that's of interest. That's an ongoing body of work. We'll see some improvement to that this year and continued improvement in the future as well. With regard to the period of time when we provide our initial service and we don't take 311 complaints, That is because I think we've been doing that practice for about 8 years now, and prior to that, people would call in while the service had not been accomplished, and it would trigger a service request and a field investigation, so sending staff out to consider whether that request was needed further action. And then the initial service that the transportation contractors would do would address it. So for example, they would call in to say, my street hasn't been plowed, when the plow was still within doing its initial service. And so we've instituted that period of time to enable the contractors and staff to deliver their initial service, and then the 311 opens up for missed service issues that we address. There's always the opportunity for escalation if things seem tremendously wrong. And so certainly we have people out patrolling. As we mentioned, we had a number of frontline staffing shortages last year that we are working actively to address. So we will have more people out patrolling, but also an escalated opportunity through counselors' offices to flag things when they are just clearly not right.
And through the chair, just to add to that, what we've done in an interim is to work with both divisions. For example, if there's property damage or if there's a safety issue, we wouldn't necessarily wait until that period is ended. We would still document that and share that information and communicate as soon as that period is able to create those service requests. This will be put to the top of the list.
Thank you. Councillor Myers, you indicated a desire for some additional questions. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Councillor Holiday. I do have one quick question. Have you already identified those snow clearers who are able to step in the event that the contractor is not performing? And can you provide some of the details on some of the changes to 311, which is a critical piece in all of this, because that's the way residents that's the way the residents reach out to the city and let them know that their windrow or sidewalk hasn't been cleared properly. And what was happening was, because residents weren't seeing action, they were filing multiple service requests on 311, which was creating its own issues. And we on the council side, we weren't able to see if these 311 requests were resolved, which led us to either calling the residents back directly or calling the city, which, was just creating more work. So what are the improvements on the 311 side? And can you let us know if you've identified the backup service providers for the snow clearance in the event that they are not performing properly?
Through the chair, I'll identify the 311 opportunities and improvements, and then I'll hand it over to Vince and team. In regards to the 311 opportunities, what we've done is through the implementation of the Salesforce, the CRM, as well as the further integrations with the EWMS system, we've ensured that there's a child and parent ticket process established. So for example, if there's a ticket that's created or a service request or complaint that's created on a particular road and someone else calls into it, we still do create a parent and child relationship, but we manage that single ticket. But the parent and child ticket is sent across to transportation so they understand the severity of that location. So it's not just one incident with that location, there might be 15. The other good thing about it as well, from a self-serve perspective, if it's on a general asset, a street, you can go onto our particular mapping system and see that there are multiple tickets that are open up in your location as well. So not only can the public see it, but members of council and other members of the division can see the multiple tickets that are being generated in that location too. In regards to the asset, the further conversations, I'll hand it over to Vince.
Thank you. Through the chair, so with respect to backup availability of other contractors, that will have to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. Weather is dynamic, and the one thing that I've come to realize more than anything else, and it's even more regional within the city of Toronto. There are some situations where some parts of the city are experiencing higher accumulation levels than others, and vice versa. So we will certainly assess each winter event and determine if, in fact, that opportunity presents itself, but we will do so, but understanding that we can really do that on a case-by-case basis.
So from that answer, I take it you haven't identified any
backup snow clearers?
So as I indicated before, the agreement allows us to approach any contractor to see if in fact they are available to provide further assistance or support in another contract zone that they may not be specifically assigned to. So that circumstance is there. Whether I can say at this point in time, all 10 are available to help each other under circumstances, we'll have to determine that based on the weather event itself. And doing so will certainly approach the contractors accordingly.
But through the chair, but we know who those people are,
Yes.
Councillor Myers. There are existing contractors who are under contract and our in-house staff. That's the capacity that we have to move things around.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Nunziata, you indicated additional questions. Please go ahead.
So when it comes to 311 calls and then calls to our office, what I found in the last winter is that we would be told by 311 or by staff that it was cleared or the issue was resolved, and then we would hear from the constituent and say, no, it's not done. So we would actually, I had my staff go out to the resident's home and take a picture and show that, no, it's not done, but we're told it was done. So there was a little bit of confusion there, miscommunication, why we would say it was done and it wasn't done. And then my second question is when it comes to, we need to coordinate somehow when we do the sidewalk clearing and then the road clearing, because we do the sidewalk clearing, it's my understanding, first, and then the road clearing comes along and throws the snow back onto the sidewalk. And then they have to go back. So there's a lot of miscommunication there. I don't know if we need to change the timing on when they do the sidewalks. Maybe they do it after they do the roads. I'm not sure, but we had a lot of that where snow was thrown back onto the sidewalk once we've been there to clear the sidewalks.
Through the chair, so with regard to the 311 service request being deemed completed and still more work is necessary, we have flagged that issue as well, Councillor Nunziata, and have identified that there, through work management, our new work management program, there's some very specific and meaningful words that are important not to confuse. So because the way that the work management system works, you can have one order that's completed but it's not actually finished. So for example, we send out, if you have a service request or say it's a blocked sidewalk, we would send out our field investigator that would have some tools to be able to address that on site or make it better, make it safe on site, but it may not be completely cleared. We would then have to go back to the contractor and complete that work. So we really, in some cases, it's a two-part process, but in no case should the homeowner or the person who's called in the complaint believe that we are no longer providing service if we still have additional service to do. So some of that is work that we're doing behind the scenes to have consistent definitions of what it means to be closed versus completed. And that sounds like a lot of detail, but we are working on that and we will make every attempt to get that sorted out this winter season.
And just to add to that, a part of the confusion is when the resident opens up a service request. That service request really deals with the point up to the triage for that issue. And then a work order is created for subsequent work, but they're not tied. Through the further work that we're going to implement towards the end of this year and into next year, there'll be further integrations and bi-directional flow of that information so that originator of that request, be it your office or be it the resident, will be able to see the activities that are found within that work order as well. So if someone, for example, 301, an agent looks at that service request, they'll also be able to see the work in that work order and not provide the incorrect information that's there today. So there's a better improvement and commitment to the end-to-end delivery of service versus us just checking off a situation saying someone's been to the site and assuming that the work has been created. So this new relationship that we have with the divisions will also demonstrate credible outcomes starting towards the end of this year and moving into 2024.
I don't know why we don't complete it the first time. We have to go back the second time because sometimes we're waiting for days and that for it to be completed. I mean, there's a lot of confusion there. I think that there has to be a lot more training for staff, and we really, I shouldn't have my staff have to go traveling all over the ward, taking pictures and showing and sending it back to you, say, no, it's not completed, you know, like it just seems like it's a lot of work and a lot of resources to complete, but those are my comments.
So, Councillor Nunzia, we would agree that there's significant improvement that can be made there. Part of the reason why it can't always be done in one pass is because the field investigator only has very limited tools in their truck to be able to maybe go in and fix a windrow or move forward with the plow. So we're looking at those equipment issues. But in any case, some of the improvements that Gary was talking about, where we could initially get pictures that are sent to us so that we could assess the situation before we send someone out to the site, will also be quite useful. And then training of our staff and actually having a full complement of staff to be able to get to those sites faster. Because I believe that the timeline between when the service request comes in and when the resident sees that it's being addressed is the critical timeline that we really need to shorten, so people know that we are able to get out there and address their issues in as timely a fashion as possible.
Thank you. Any other questions? Members wishing to speak? Okay, I'll provide a very brief comment. Really, thank you to Madam Auditor General, your team, to Transportation Services staff, and including even the people that are out there driving the snowplow at 3 in the morning. I think everyone can see from the interest and the multiple rounds of questions that winter maintenance is a topic of interest to members of council, and that's because it is very interesting to citizens of this city. And this was a tough winter, and I think we've talked a little bit about the reasons why today. New people involved, new technology not implemented, and equipment that wasn't there. And all of that created a situation where the public was pointing out, this is all wrong. You know, we're used to this. We understand how this unfolds winter to winter. Why didn't it happen this way? Why didn't it happen this way? And, you know, look, as counselors, we've all been through this, right? Somebody has been snowed in on their driveway and they're waiting 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 hours for the clearing plow to come by, and it's just not logical. And so, yes, it's a service that people critically rely on because they can't leave their homes until much of this work is done. But I guess the overarching piece is that it's a public confidence issue in the government. People look out their window after the snowstorm and they say, look, you know, the municipal government hasn't done what it is that we expect them to do or what they've done every year, year over year. And it erodes their trust. And so that's why it's such a politically sensitive issue for councillors, but also a very practical one. So I think what you see here are councillors that are interested in finding out ways to help and make the system better. We see a commitment from staff to improve things. We see an Auditor General that is, you know, a 100-page report here that's just an interim step, shows how important this is. I hope that message trickles along the continuum of service providers, that it reaches right through the vendors and to the operators to know that this is important to us in the City of Toronto. And we're all looking forward to a much better winter this go around. And with that, again, thank you to everybody involved, and I think everyone does appreciate the importance and the gravity of this particular subject matter. Okay, I'll just call the vote on the staff recommendations. All those in favor? Any opposed? And that item carries. Thank you. Okay, we're on to the next report. That is AU 2.7. City of Toronto's Modular Housing Initiative, the need to balance fast delivery with stronger management of contracts and costs. We do have a presentation from Madam Auditor General. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Actually, Chair, thank you. I think I'm going to show the video. It's a little bit shorter. It gives a little bit of change of pace, and then management has a presentation following. Just while we get that ready, I'd just like to acknowledge and thank my team. So I have Ariane Chan, Assistant Auditor General, Matthew Crisafulli, Senior Audit Manager, and Cindy Lee, Audit Manager. So it'll just take a minute to get the video up and running. Do you need the audio?
Toronto has an urgent homelessness crisis, with shelters regularly at capacity and over 10,500 people experiencing homelessness. As an urgent response to the need for safe, supportive, affordable homes, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, in spring 2020, staff were asked by City Council to build housing as quickly as possible under the Modular Housing Initiative. To date, 159 modular housing units have been built. As of March 2023, the total projected cost for all 5 buildings, totaling 275 units, is $85 million, compared to an adjusted budget of $52 million. The 63% cost escalation was caused by many factors, including an increase in housing construction cost industry-wide, due in part to the COVID-19 pandemic, and our audit also highlights additional reasons. The objectives of our audit examine the procurement, contract, and cost management of the Modular Housing Initiative, and whether this construction method was faster and less expensive than traditional construction. Our key audit findings focused on the second objective of contract and cost management, as we had some limitations on others due to lack of available documentation. The first 2 modular buildings, totaling 100 units, were ready for occupancy just 5 months after the start of construction. However, since the first 2 buildings were built, the city has seen a slowdown of the building speed. The third module building took 13 months to build and opened in November of 2022. The fourth building is near completion, while the fifth experienced significant delay. For future module builds, overall, our audit found that the city needs to balance the need to deliver housing fast while managing contracts and costs more closely. This can help avoid and reduce unexpected delays and costs. This audit found the budget did not include some of the site-specific costs that would have been identified through planning and due diligence procedures. Some of these identified costs led to delays and higher construction costs. City staff informed us that in order to achieve the aggressive timeline required by City Council and as a condition of federal funding, they had to fast-track the projects, which impacted their approach to due diligence and project planning. The audit also found that transparency of the modular housing project costs could be improved, as there was no regular report backs on cost information to City Council, such as detailed budget increases, cost escalations, and variance analysis. Change orders are construction contract amendments that change the contract scope of work. In order to meet tight timelines and avoid delays, staff allowed the contractor to proceed with change order work without first receiving approval from management. This led to disagreements with the contractor over the scope of work and additional costs. The audit also found that the city needs to strengthen its documentation and record retention practices. The Auditor General has made 20 recommendations to help the city manage future modular housing projects. To find out more, visit torontoauditor.ca.
Don't get another expensive facial before you watch this.
Okay, that was it.
Skin hack.
So, and now management is going to come and present their management presentation.
Just letting the vice chair know I'm back. Please proceed when you're ready. Thank you.
Everyone. I'm Abby Bond. I'm the Executive Director of the Housing Secretariat, and we're pleased today to join you to talk about the modular housing audit and some of our responses to that. Okay, next slide. So we launched the Modular Housing Initiative as an urgent response to the city's growing homelessness crisis. It is a significant action that we took in the first part of the pandemic that really demonstrates real action that acknowledges our commitment to housing as a human right, which was embedded into our newly approved 10-year plan at the time. In April of 2020, Council really looked to us to expedite at least 250 homes over 2 phases as a result of having secured over $47.5 million in capital funding, including funding from both the city and also CMHC in the form of grants and loans. And overall, this was the expedited kind of first step towards a larger target of 1,000 new modular homes by 2020. And importantly, they were supportive housing homes, which is part of our 18,000 commitment in 10 years. So this first phase of the 275 modular homes, this is what is within the scope of the audit that we're here today to talk about. These are either complete or approaching completion in development. The first 2 sites were completed, as the video highlighted, within 5 months of the construction site, and have provided 100 homes at both 11 Macy and 321 Dovercourt. They were completed in December of 2020 and January of 2021. There are 2 additional projects in phase 2, which are either complete at 540 Cedar Vale, which opened in November of 2022, or nearing completion at 39 Dundalk, which is due to be completed by the end of July 2023. The 5th project at 175 Cummer has been appealed to the Ontario Land Tribunal. So when we launched in April 2020, Toronto was the first jurisdiction in Ontario to really be looking at this modular approach to delivering supportive housing. And so it did provide some really limited local examples for how we would benchmark, including for costing. There were limited availability of examples that we could use to inform our program and the overall budget. During the course of delivering the program, during the pandemic, we've seen construction costs really increase significantly, around 20% year on year. That's a result of labor shortages, supply chain interruptions, and generally this has happened for both modular and construction costs generally across the city. The project at 175 Cummer is really the project that continues to face upwardly increasing costs, including for transportation and storage costs, as we are currently storing all the modules. This is a result of the delays in obtaining the zoning approvals. So overall, over our entire program, the city requested and received 7 ministerial zoning orders for other supportive housing projects during the 2-year period of 2020 and 2021. And 175 Cummer is the only site where a requested MZO has not yet been issued by the province of Ontario. On behalf of my staff team and also all of the other divisions at the city and Creatio who have participated in this audit, we would really like to thank the Auditor General for what has been a really important exercise and a really helpful report. The recommendations that are outlined here today will significantly strengthen the delivery of our program, which is so important considering how much more work we have to do to deliver supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness in our city. Management want to agree, or we do agree, with all 20 recommendations. Many of them are already implemented or underway, and we have timelines and goals for delivering the remaining of the delivering or meeting the remaining of the recommendations, including we're expecting imminent confirmation of funding from the federal government on the Rapid Housing Initiative. So this report and these recommendations are incredibly timely for us and will really set us up for success in this next phase. I just want to summarize a couple of the key areas and acknowledge a couple of the key areas of improvement. So moving forward, I want to highlight that all of the procurement related to the modular design build will be managed by Corporate Real Estate Management, our CREM division. In terms of the need for better project planning and budgeting, there is a significantly stronger due diligence package that we are implementing as part of the site selection for the next phase of modular housing. This needs to be continue to be refined, but it will include much more detailed work of kind of subsurface infrastructure or on the adjacent sites to put us in a better position, better knowledge about what is below ground and what the sites actually have to offer. In terms of some of the improvements already underway, I want to highlight that we have implemented a standard budget template and also lessons learned from the prior projects. We have more work to do on this, but this is already underway. Continuing with the theme of better project planning and budgeting, I want to highlight that we agree with the recommendations to not proceed with manufacturing modular units until zoning is in effect, subject to funding requirements. It's important to us that we are able to move forward quickly, and our aims to line up or do concurrently both the approvals for the modular sites and also the manufacturing to streamline delivery have resulted in some of the delays and increased costs that you see for 175 Comma, where we were not able to secure the required approvals for the zoning. We have shared previously and will be sharing the detail both of the video and the reports once all approved with CMHC. And I can report that they have been listening to us, and certainly in the most recent round of funding that they issued, their requirements, timelines around site selection and also the overall delivery timelines increased significantly from the first phases that we were responding to. The next area I want to highlight is about how we strengthen, track, monitor, and report costs. We agree with the recommendations to implement a revised financial management and tracking system and are aiming to do this by Q1 of 2024. In addition, we are in the process of developing shared formal policies and procedures and reporting templates for the purposes of improved tracking against project costs and budgets. And finally, I want to highlight a couple of additional areas. We acknowledge that we need to strengthen the review processes for change orders and invoice payments. We've begun the procurement of a payment certifier to validate invoices for all ongoing modular projects, and that will be finalized in Q3 of this year. We've also begun to implement a new change control process, which will be fully implemented by the end of 2023. And I want to highlight that all of the overcharges that were identified in this report have been addressed with repayment secured against any unpaid invoices. And finally, we want to acknowledge that we are in the process of a final review for all existing design build contracts for the next phase of RHI. And finally, also that we're completing amendments to the project management process and the playbooks by the end of 2023 to reflect all of the recommendations in this audit. And this concludes our comments for this part of the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Malik, I know you've got questions on this particular item. Please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the background and the presentations and video. The report states the approval of this modular housing was, quote, an urgent response to the housing need for people experiencing homelessness, unquote. I guess my question's simple. Did this work reach that goal?
Through the chair, I think our team is very proud of the outcomes delivered. You saw through the video the number of buildings that we were able to complete in a very difficult time where construction was under pressure during the pandemic, experiencing homelessness. Clearly, this report identifies that we can do even better, that there's a lot of areas where we can strengthen our performance, both so that we continue to meet the needs of residents in our city and do it in a way which is more on time and more on budget.
So just to be clear, does the updated actual cost still outweigh the benefits of modular housing versus traditional construction?
Through the chair, as identified in the report that you see before you today, the Auditor General identifies that we need to do more to collect information about that and to benchmark that more effectively. Based on our kind of knowledge of what we see of other projects, we think that is still true, that modular provides a more cost-effective approach than traditional construction. But as the Auditor General has provided, we can really strengthen and make that case stronger by collecting more indicators and benchmark information. We intend to do that for committee and council in the future.
Thank you. Also in the report, it states, city staff informed us that to achieve the aggressive timeline required by the federal funding provider, they had to make decisions quickly and fast-track the project as much as possible, which gave them less time for due diligence and project planning. This raises a number of concerns, as we've seen a number of federal and provincial programs expecting quick turnarounds arising lately. How can this issue be addressed citywide and not just in regards to modular housing?
So maybe I can just quickly say with regard to the supportive housing funding, we did see a significant difference. The first funding we received had a 30-day due diligence period. And so it really wasn't possible for us to do all the below ground assessment of sites that would have been necessary to avoid the cost that we then incurred. The latest round was 90 days. So we were able to do significantly more. And that feedback loop between actual delivery and the program design has really been strengthened through our communication with the federal government. It's difficult for me to comment about other areas that aren't related to housing, but I think we see a federal government investing in infrastructure and learning as we are, and making sure that those feedback loops are quick and real will really help both their program design and our program implementation.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Nunziata.
Thank you for the presentation. So is some of the increased costs is related as well to the delay for the city for rezoning of these sites as well? Because it does take a while to go through the planning process, not just on modular housing, but on all affordable housing applications. And delays is costs.
Through the chair, I would say that actually for the modular housing initiative, the rezonings, the time for rezoning, apart from 175 Comma, have not played a role significantly in the costs and the delays to the projects. The majority of cost increases came from two areas, one being the kind of year-on-year escalation in construction costs that we've seen across the city. And the other area of significance was the fact that we were responding to the site conditions while we were on site doing construction, and that increased delays to the project while the site issues were rectified while we were in construction, and also the costs associated with that. So I would say those are the two main aims. I do want to say, though, that the city can always do better with regard to the speed at which we approve affordable housing. We know that time is money when it comes to nonprofit and private sector partners.
Right, yeah, I have one in my ward. So as far as the community consultation meetings that you have with the local councillors and that is that the first step? Like sometimes there could be delays in those consultation meetings as well. Or does the process start through the planning and then consultation?
Maybe I can comment. I don't know if my colleague Kerry Van Varkes wants to add, but I would say that we expedited the community consultation significantly, but we didn't bypass it. Therefore, for these projects, there were around 14 community engagement events that were held. And so we really just, we did all of those within a really condensed period of time, but we did hold them. We were also doing that during a pandemic. So all of the consultation events that we held, almost all the consultation events we held were virtual. But I don't know if my colleague wants to add anything.
Thank you, Abby. Just say,
Chair.
Vic, you had your hand up?
I was only going to add, sorry, and then Carol certainly, just in terms of the process, I think through you, Mr. Chair, we would start with site selection and we would do a due diligence on trying to identify suitable sites. And we certainly looked through a number of sites. And again, with such an abridged timeframe, we tried to fast track that as much as possible to identify suitable sites. And once we had sites, then of course, we would consult with the local community and the councillor.
Okay.
To add through the chair, in terms of the community consultation, it was fairly robust, even though it was virtual. The notifications were to a broader area than would be given if it was through a rezoning application. And the ward councillors also held individual meetings with smaller interest groups and with groups of community partners who were interested in the proposals.
Just one last question. The fifth project that has been appealed. So because of the appeal, then there will be added cost, of course, to this project, right?
Through the chair, yes, we're already have incurred additional transportation and storage costs of around, our storage costs are around $77,000 per month. So that is ongoing while we wait for the appeal to play out. And then we're also considering potential additional costs from the original costs which were quoted to install the units on site, but that is still under discussion with the manufacturer.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just check with Councillor Myers, just because the connection isn't great. If you had questions.
Yes.
Okay.
I did have a couple questions.
Please go
so
ahead.
On page 50, oh, thank you. On page 53 of the report, I'm just looking specifically at 540 Cedarvale Avenue, which was announced as a Housing Now site on February 23rd, but we didn't actually approach the minister for a zoning order until June 8th. So I'm just wondering why there was a delay between March, April, and May.
Through the chair, I'll start, and then I'm sure my colleague will want to jump in. There is significant work that has to be done before the ministerial zoning order can be requested to get the concept designed for the site. So as soon as we had confirmation of funding, we began the design work for the site, and that all needs to be significantly far along before we can make the request to the MZO, for the MZO.
Thank you. And I'm just looking, so the on-site construction at 540 Cedarvale Avenue started October 25th, and it was ready for occupancy November 15th, so that's 13 months later.
And from my understanding, modular housing was supposed to be weeks. That was the whole point. That was the point of why this was such an innovative technology and approach. So I'm just wondering why this took 13 months from the time construction began to when it was ready for occupancy.
We should go through this.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Myers. It's Pat Matozo, Councillor. So with respect, there were some unforeseen site conditions, one being a water table that was discovered as part of excavation. So then we had to dig deeper to take out a lot of the soft soil. Then there's something that's not in the Ontario Code that is a city policy that was uncovered halfway through the project called FUS fire flow. What it means is the amount of water going through the water pipes into the building. That required a scope change and a redesign to actually put in a firewall. So those two, one being an authorities having jurisdiction and the other being an unforeseen site condition, is what pushed out the project and caused a delay.
Thank you. And I guess my question really goes to, I support all of the Auditor General's recommendations, but if this is how long it takes to build one of these projects, is it realistic to expect that we're going to reach our target as outlined in the Housing Action Plan of having 1,000 of these in 2030?
Through the chair, thank you, Councillor, for your question. We're still very focused on delivery on that goal and think it is possible. Certainly, as I said, this report is very timely for us and is very helpful to identify where we should improve and focus. But I would also say that our ability to reach that goal is very much determined by the degree of investment, capital funding and operating that we receive from the federal government in relation to capital and provincial government in relation to operating. Without that, no matter how good or efficient our processes are, we won't reach that target. So I think it's a case of important lessons for us in terms of how we do this, how we come together as divisions to deliver on our goals, but also highlighting the huge amount of importance and our great reliance on the other levels of government to meet the needs, the housing needs of residents in our city experiencing homelessness.
Thank you. And we briefly spoke about this when you gave a very, very helpful presentation prior to this meeting. Do you have any thoughts on work that we can do, even prior to receiving federal or provincial funding commitments, so that we're ready to hit the ground running, rather than having any sort of delay, at least on the city's end? Do you have any thoughts as to how we can make this process even more efficient?
Yes, through the chair, that's a great question, thank you. And there's a couple of things I want to highlight that we've already begun to do. So the procurement work for the next phase of modular is already underway. And so we'll be ready by the time we receive the confirmation of funding, which is really important. We're also going to expedite our kind of lessons learned process. So if there's anything further to extract in terms of knowledge, we're going to do that over the summer and into the fall so that we're ready to hit the ground running. And we've also had much more time in this round to do the due diligence associated with the site preparation, with the aim of not hitting some of the issues and obstacles that we did in the previous rounds in relation to the sites. And then finally, another thing that we want to initiate this year is a full evaluation of the outcomes in relation to supportive housing. It's important for us to not just track the projects in terms of their budget and timeline, but also the outcomes for individuals who are moving into those buildings. And so that will also help us in our procurement of nonprofit operators and also in requests to the province for the operating fund. So those are a few things that are either underway or that we intend to do this year that will strengthen our position for the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's my turn for questions. I just want to follow the timeline of all of the unfolding of the modular housing program. Do I have this right? Council earlier indicated its desire to create supportive housing units. In April of 2020, council adopted a report, which I think was really the first genesis of modular housing. And then at a later point in time, council adopted some recommendations regarding Comer Avenue. Could you just confirm those pieces for me, just how this unfolded?
Yes. So to you, Chair, the approach to use modular housing was confirmed by Council in December of 2019 when it approved its 10-year housing plan. So Housing TO, that full comprehensive 10-year plan included some significant goals around both the use of modular, but also the 18,000 goal for supportive housing. So that was the first time those goals were set. Then in March, we all entered the pandemic period and the lockdown. And so in April, we tried to, through that council report, we tried to bring forward and expedite the first phase of delivery on modular. And then later, when we're talking about Comer Avenue, after we requested an MZO for that site and didn't hear anything on that site, we then went back to council after 2 rounds of engagement with the community to request a rezone, that council rezone the site, which we did. That was approved, and we then received an appeal on that rezoning.
The use of modular technology, was that a staff recommendation from the report, or was that something that was brought forward by council?
The use of modular technology was included as a target in the original Housing TO report. So it was identified that that was something that was approved by council. It was recommended by staff, but then particularly the desire to expedite most quickly that first phase of delivery. Modular was seen to be a good way to do that. And so that's why it was included in the April 2020 report.
Okay, so from the April 2020 report, staff came back to council regarding Comer Avenue. What approvals were given? And I'm just trying to understand the accountability of council's decision and what risks were before council in giving various approvals, because as it turns out, there was a sequencing issue. Zoning was not in place, and I guess somehow the process began with respect to the acquiring of those units. So somebody had to make approvals at certain points in time, and I just wanted to know where that rests.
So the April 2020 report provided us the ability to move forward with all of the, subject to funding and agreements with CMHC, all of our approvals in relation to funding. So it gave us that authority. So by the time we requested the MZO, by the time we first started that approval process on the planning side for 175 Comer, we had already initiated the manufacturing at that point with NRB, our manufacturer. The reason for that was because of the timelines associated with the funding. We needed concurrent processes to happen. And so that was already, we were already into manufacturing. And so then when we didn't receive the MZO and we went back out for community engagement and then came back to council for the final kind of rezoning approval, we were already well underway with the manufacturing for those units, and as a result have had to put them into storage externally and internally.
So the launch of the manufacturing or the commitment to the vendor was made under delegated authority. And I guess my question to you is, was council aware of the risks of this approach, or was there a way that council could have been better aware of the risks of these approaches?
To you, Chair, I think we can always, certainly in this report, we've indicated our desire to be more transparent and have regular reports with council. The way that Comer Avenue has played out has been unexpected, I think, for many of us. Certainly, our desire to use and request ministerial zoning orders was for this program in order to avoid some of the outcomes that we've seen for Comer Avenue. So could we have informed council that there was risk? risk there. I think we did highlight to council some of the risks around ministerial zoning orders at the time, but I don't know that we could have anticipated that the ministerial zoning order would not have been approved, since 7 others were for very similar buildings. And obviously now we're into an OLT hearing and the outcome remains uncertain.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Members wishing to speak? Councillor Nunziata moves the recommendations. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Members, I do take note, we've got 3 minutes left. We've got one item, and I just want to confirm if it's the will of the committee that we complete the last item. The sense I get is that it won't be prolonged. And I don't know if we can connect with Councillor Myers just to make sure he's okay, but I sense he would probably be appreciative as well.
It's only one item, it's not a long item. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll move forward on the final item. Thank you. Sorry, motion to extend the meeting. All those to complete the item. All those in favor? That is carried. Our final item. Allow me to shuffle some papers here. AU 2.9, investigation into allegations of wrongdoing regarding building inspections of 2 houses. Madam Auditor General, I believe you have some comments for us.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I'd like to acknowledge my team members on this investigation from our forensic unit. So we have Sean McIntosh, Director, Laura Wright, Manager, and Chong Ta, Auditor, and Celia Tao from our Performance Audit team also helped out. So this investigation looked into allegations of wrongdoing related to the construction of 2 large houses by one builder. The complainant made 4 allegations, including that the builder was not constructing the houses in accordance with the permits approved by Toronto Building and that the houses were potentially unsafe. As part of this investigation, the chief building official, at the Auditor General's request, directed that re-inspections of the houses be done by different, very experienced inspectors from different districts from where the houses were being built. In terms of our conclusions, we substantiated one of the allegations that the builder made material changes to the houses without having those material changes approved by Toronto Building. The second allegation we were unable to determine, in part due to a lack of available documentation, as well as the complication of a fire at House 1, which occurred near completion and prior to the final occupancy inspection. The third and fourth allegations were unsubstantiated. While this investigation only focuses on 2 houses and 1 builder, it demonstrates the risk that some builders might be making unapproved changes to their buildings that are not in compliance with the Ontario Building Code and/or not approved by Toronto Building, and therefore could be unsafe. The risk is further increased if Toronto Building is either not notified by the builder to review and inspect the changes, and/or the changes are not caught during the inspection process. Other issues we identified during this investigation included a risk-based approach to inspections is not used, the importance of using powers to enforce compliance, material and noteworthy changes were not identified through the inspection process, the inspection order is not always logical, and the city-approved plans were not always used for inspections. We've made 6 recommendations in this report, as well as our 20 recommendations from our recent audit report of Toronto Building's inspection function, and management has agreed to all of the recommendations. We feel that implementing these recommendations will help the division to be in a stronger position to carry out its mandate, helping to ensure the safety of buildings in Toronto. And I'd like to thank the management and staff at the Toronto Building Division for their assistance during this investigation.
Thank you. Are there questions of staff? Councillor Nunziata.
Questions to building. I guess what I want to know then is what is the status then of these 2 homes if they under the building code? Like, were they asked to? What were they asked to do?
So for the 2 houses, so one of the houses had burnt down, so that house doesn't exist anymore.
Okay.
With respect to the other house, the inspectors did issue orders to obtain revisions to the issued building permit, and inspectors found that the houses were built in compliance with the building code.
Okay, so do we, I mean, there are a lot of builders or even homeowners that when they get building permits, they don't build according to what the plans are. I mean, so many of that has happened, you know? So do we do like a final inspection at the end when it's completed, so we know if there are any deficiencies, or is it only by complaint?
Through the chair, Councillor, so final inspections are done. So building code mandates mandatory inspections for houses. Those inspections are carried out, and during final inspection, again, if there are any deficiencies noticed, those are also identified, and no house is signed off until those deficiencies are corrected.
So is that done in the final inspection? Do we do a final inspection once everything's completed? Or, because sometimes what they do is they do other work after you've inspected.
Through the chair, we do a final inspection as well as the other inspections as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? I had a couple. Thank you for the report, Madam Auditor, and for the work of Toronto Building on this. There was a little piece in there that surprised me, and and I'm going to go by memory because it was a long report, but in one of the situations, an architect had prepared, or an engineer, or a qualified professional had prepared the documentation, the designs for the project. And then at one point, new drawings were submitted, but they didn't have an architect's stamp on them. And there was some discussion in here about it being a Part 9 building. So at that point, a qualified professional wasn't required. That surprised me, and I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more about what the law says about who can prepare designs.
Certainly. The building code permits qualified individuals to prepare designs.
Right.
As well as a homeowner can prepare their own design for their own building. So those are the two circumstances. So
Under Part 9.
Under Part 9.
So I can take out my pencil crayons and design my home and submit those drawings to you, and away we go?
So a homeowner, if they're capable, have the skill set to do so, crayons is probably an exaggeration.
Agreed.
But a qualified homeowner could technically prepare drawings, submit for permit, and we would, as you know, as authority having jurisdiction, review those drawings for compliance with the building code.
So I take it the lesson learned out of this, that if there's drawings prepared by an architect and suddenly they're no longer prepared by that individual, does that raise concern? You know, and I'm not saying there's a concern, but does it raise interest to the building department?
Under the regulations set within the Building Code Act, the homeowners are in their right to be able to design those houses. So again, we would still verify compliance. They would still need to demonstrate compliance, whether the house is designed by a professional or a homeowner. It doesn't negate the need to verify compliance and for them to comply with the regulation.
So in this, and I don't know if it was the same piece because there was a lot going on in the report, but there was a story about how there was windows designed and then somebody built some extra windows. And of course, you know, the area of windows on a face of a building in relation to its setback to its neighbor is regulated by the code. And I guess questions were raised on that. So who ends up doing the calculations to check, to make sure that, you know, they haven't created a situation where there's a fire issue? Does that fall on the homeowner, or does the building department then go back and do the work and check it?
So ultimately, the designer is responsible, whether that designer happens to be a home, whether it happens to be, a homeowner, whether or an architect. That responsibility to ensure that what they're proposing complies with the code and then is presented, you know, in that manner. But again, as a municipality having jurisdiction, you know, if we're passing something that doesn't comply, we are at
Right.
holding some risk there as well.
Okay.
Through you, Chair, maybe I can just add a little clarity on that would help with this. I think the point that you're raising is a really important one, is that while the building code does allow a homeowner to prepare their own drawings for and submit for permit, I think what's incumbent on the building division when they're doing that, when they see that it is a homeowner, I think there needs to be a lot more scrutiny on it, because under the Building Code Act, typically, unless they're the homeowner, they require provincial qualifications to submit those drawings. And I think what's incumbent on the building division is that when you see it's a homeowner doing it, it's really important that there's more scrutiny put on that, because that person, we don't know whether or not they have the qualifications to do that, even though the law provides for them to do it.
Okay, for clarity, the carve-out is the homeowner, not just any person.
That's correct.
Okay. And so the last question I've got, and I'm not going to move a motion, but maybe I would just sort of ask for assurances on this. Do we have a way to bridge the lessons learned in this auditor's report with professional associations like the Professional Engineers of Ontario, Ontario Architects Association, ARITO, those kind of people that are involved in this? Because when a professional consultant is involved in a situation where changes are going on and inspections fall out of sequence and so on, is there not an ethical thread in there that they be paying attention to this if they're involved in that process?
So through you, Chair, I would agree with you. And I think there's an opportunity here for us to engage more with the industry to make sure they're very clear around what our expectations are through this when they're applying for permits and through the inspection process, what those expectations are. And I think the auditor's recommendations that she's provided here will help to strengthen that. But I think, going to your point, that is something we will do.
Okay, I'm going to slip one more in because I forgot. Does MLS not license certain businesses that would also be doing work on these sites? And therefore, if we had issues with compliance, could there be a mechanism to connect back to the business licensing regime?
Through you, Chair, that is something that has come up, and I could have this wrong, so I should really confirm with MLS, but my understanding is they don't have the ability to license those trades.
Okay, that was all my questions. Thank you. Any members wishing to speak on this item? I'm going slow because of the connection issues here. Okay, we don't see any members. Could somebody please move the staff recommendations, or I'll do that with my thanks to the Madam Auditor General and the Toronto Building. All those in favor of the recommendations of the report? Any opposed? That item is carried. That is our final item of business, Mr. Clerk. And so therefore, I will thank everybody for their participation in today's meeting and let you know that the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Chair.